In the autumn mist of 1914, something unprecedented began to emerge from the trenches of the Western Front. British soldiers, seemingly unharmed by bullet or bayonet, were arriving at field hospitals exhibiting the strangest of symptoms. They trembled uncontrollably, stared blankly into space, and some could not speak at all. Others walked with inexplicable limps, their hands shaking like leaves in a storm, despite bearing no visible wounds. By December 1914, as many as 10% of British officers and 4% of enlisted men were experiencing what military doctors termed nervous and mental shock. The Great War had only just begun, yet already it was producing something the medical world had never encountered on such a scale. What they were witnessing would come to be known as shell shock, and it would forever change how we understand the hidden wounds that war inflicts upon the human mind. The genesis of shell shock as a recognized medical condition can be traced to a single moment in February 1915, when Captain Charles Myers of the Royal Army Medical Corps published a landmark article in The Lancet, documenting the remarkably close similarity of symptoms in 3 soldiers who had each been exposed to exploding shells. The first case had endured 6 or 7 shells exploding around him. The second had been buried under earth for 18 hours after a shell collapsed his trench. The third had been blown off a pile of bricks 15 feet high. Myers observed that all 3 men exhibited identical symptoms: reduced visual fields, loss of smell and taste, and significant memory loss. Yet none showed any obvious physical injuries. Comment on these cases seems superfluous, Myers concluded, after documenting the symptoms in detail. They appear to constitute a definite class among others arising from the effects of shell shock. Myers later claimed that he did not invent the term and that he hated it, though he was the first to use it in academic literature. The War Office's own 1922 report acknowledged that the term was born of the necessity for finding at the moment some designation thought to be suitable for the number of cases of functional nervous incapacity which were continually occurring among the fighting units. The alliteration and dramatic significance of shell shock had caught the public imagination, and there would be no escape from its use, even as medical understanding evolved far beyond its original meaning. What made shell shock particularly perplexing was its apparent randomness. Medical authorities discovered that numerous cases were occurring where the evidence indicated that the patients had not even been within hearing of a shell burst. Some men broke down during basic training before they had ever seen combat. Others lasted months in the trenches before succumbing. The condition seemed to respect neither rank nor previous reputation for courage. The scale of the problem was staggering. Over 250,000 men would suffer from shell shock as a result of the First World War, though some estimates suggest the true number was much higher. Among British armies on the Western Front alone, there were over 80,000 recorded cases, while estimates among German troops ranged from 200,000 to 300,000, with French casualties being similar or possibly higher. To understand shell shock, we must first understand the nature of the war that produced it. The Great War was unlike any conflict that had come before. Where previous wars had been fought with muskets and swords, this was a war of industry, a mechanized nightmare of unprecedented scale and horror. The Western Front stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a 475-mile scar across Europe, where millions of men faced each other across no man's land. The trenches themselves were a new kind of battlefield, a labyrinth of mud, wire, and death, where soldiers lived like moles, emerging only to face machine gun fire and artillery barrages that could be heard for miles. The psychological impact of this environment cannot be overstated. Men who had signed up expecting glorious charges and heroic cavalry actions instead found themselves trapped in flooded ditches, surrounded by the bodies of their comrades, listening to the endless thunder of shells that might at any moment, erase them from existence. The first mental casualties appeared after the Battle of Mons in 1914, displaying a baffling range of symptoms: tics, trembling, functional paralysis, hysterical blindness and deafness, speech disorders ranging from stuttering to mutism, confusion, extreme anxiety, headaches, amnesia, depression, unexplained cramps, fainting and vomiting. The terminology used to describe these conditions evolved rapidly as doctors struggled to categorize what they were seeing. Shell shock was just one of many terms employed. Throughout the war, men were described using a wide range of other terms: hysteria, neurasthenia, hybrid hysteria, anxiety neurosis, neurocirculatory asthenia, effort syndrome, disordered action of the heart, irritable heart syndrome, functional heart trouble, and cardiac neurosis. The confusion in terminology reflected a deeper confusion about the nature of the condition itself. Was shell shock a physical injury caused by the concussive effects of exploding shells? Was it a psychological breakdown brought on by the stress of combat? Or was it, as many military authorities suspected, simply cowardice dressed up in medical language? The military's approach to shell shock was complicated by practical considerations that had little to do with medicine. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, as many as 40% of casualties were shell-shocked, adding enormously to the loss of manpower. The British Army simply could not afford to lose so many men to a condition that left them physically intact but mentally unable to fight. The bureaucratic response was to create increasingly complex classification systems. In 1915, the British Army in France was instructed that shell shock cases should have the letter W prefixed to their casualty report if it was due to enemy action, entitling the patient to rank as wounded and wear a wound stripe. However, if the breakdown did not follow a shell explosion, the man was labelled shell shock S for sickness and was not entitled to a wound stripe or pension. This distinction created a cruel irony. Men who had suffered identical symptoms were treated entirely differently, based on whether they happened to be near an explosion when they broke down. Those labelled as wounded received medical care and financial support. Those labelled as sick were often viewed with suspicion and faced the possibility of military discipline. The difficulty of making such distinctions became apparent almost immediately. Information on whether a casualty had been close to a shell explosion was rarely provided, making it nearly impossible to determine which cases were which. The system was fundamentally flawed, based as it was on the false assumption that proximity to explosions was the determining factor in shell shock. By 1917, military authorities had become so concerned about the implications of the shell shock diagnosis that the term was entirely banned in the British Army, with mentions of it censored even in medical journals. Medical officers were instead instructed to label suspected cases as not yet diagnosed, nervous, or NYDN until they could be assessed by specialists. The attempts to suppress discussion of shell shock reflected the military's fear that acknowledging the condition might encourage malingering or undermine morale. There was a persistent belief that shell shock was contagious, that knowledge of the condition might cause it to spread through the ranks like a psychological epidemic. This fear was not entirely unfounded, as military doctors observed that shell shock rates seemed to correlate with unit morale and leadership quality. The symptoms of shell shock were as varied as they were disturbing. Soldiers reported tinnitus, amnesia, headaches, dizziness, tremors, and hypersensitivity to noise. Many developed what appeared to be physical disabilities with no organic cause. The most common presenting feature was a gait disorder, with soldiers unable to walk normally despite having no injuries to their legs. Speech disorders were particularly common and distressing. 65 cases at Queen Square Hospital in London involved problems with speech production, either presenting as stuttering and stammering or complete inability to talk or even whisper. The mutism was often selective. Some men could speak normally until the topic turned to the war, at which point they would fall silent. Combat stress reactions ranged from crippling panic attacks, anxiety, and persistent amnesia to tremor, word blindness, nightmares, and other physical manifestations. Some soldiers developed what doctors called conversion symptoms, psychological distress that manifested as physical disabilities. Men would lose the use of their limbs, their sight, or their hearing, despite having no physical damage to explain these impairments. The trembling was perhaps the most characteristic symptom. Alfred Griffin of the King's Royal Rifle Corps remembered witnessing soldiers who couldn't stop shaking and trembling, their whole bodies racked with uncontrollable spasms. Some soldiers shook so violently that they had to be strapped to stretchers for transport. Not all symptoms were immediately apparent. Many soldiers appeared normal during the day but suffered terrifying breakdowns at night. Thomas Olive explained how his wartime experiences manifested in civilian life. I used to have little breakdowns now and then, and my wife used to be very frightened. It more or less used to happen at night, when I was in bed. I used to spring up off the bed, It used to frighten her. The unpredictability of shell shock was one of its most frightening aspects. Clifford Lane of the Hertfordshire Regiment remembered, "Every time I went over the top, I should say almost every time, somebody went insane. Only one person probably, but I can see them now coming along, singing, They're absolutely lost their control of everything. I can remember one man coming along with two men, one either side holding his arms, singing Under the Old Apple Tree. He was blaring it out, top of his voice. The fear of developing shell shock became almost as debilitating as the condition itself. As one veteran explained, what we felt, we'd rather lose a leg, be wounded, anything but to have shell shock. We were all afraid of shell shock. Oh, it hit the nerves, and the fellows that had come out their fingers would be waving about like tissue paper. They never really recovered in mind, a lot of them. This fear was not irrational. Shell shock carried a stigma that physical wounds did not. Veterans understood that while society could accept and honor a man who had lost a limb in service to his country, it struggled to comprehend or respect a man whose mind had been broken by the same service. The medical profession itself was divided in its understanding of shell shock. Some doctors genuinely believed it was a physical condition caused by the concussive effects of artillery bombardment. They theorized that the repeated shock waves from exploding shells caused microscopic damage to the brain and nervous system, similar to the way a severe blow to the head might cause a concussion. This theory seemed logical given the unprecedented scale of artillery bombardment on the Western Front. The guns of the Great War were larger and more powerful than anything previously seen in warfare. A single heavy artillery piece could fire shells weighing several hundred pounds over distances of many miles. The sound of these guns was so loud it could be heard in London from battles taking place in France. When concentrated barrages were fired, the earth itself would shake for miles around. Yet as more cases accumulated, the physical theory became increasingly difficult to sustain. Medical officers discovered that, in very many cases, the change from civil life brought about by enlistment and physical training was sufficient to cause neurasthenic and hysterical symptoms, and that the wear and tear of a prolonged campaign of trench warfare, with its terrible hardships and anxieties, and of attack and perhaps repulse, produced a condition of mind and body properly falling under the term war neurosis. The realization that shell shock could occur without exposure to shellfire forced a fundamental reconsideration of the condition. Some 60 to 80% of shell shock cases displayed acute neurasthenia, while 10% displayed what would now be termed symptoms of conversion disorder, including mutism and fugue states. The military's response to shell shock was shaped by competing pressures. On one hand, there was a genuine concern for the welfare of the troops. On the other hand, There was an acute awareness that acknowledging shell shock as a legitimate war injury might encourage malingering and undermine military discipline. The tension between these concerns would define the treatment of shell shock throughout the war. Initially, shell shock cases were rapidly evacuated from the front line, partly because of fear over their frequently dangerous and unpredictable behavior. This policy proved problematic as the war progressed, and manpower became increasingly precious. In the year to April 1916, 24,000 shell shock casualties had been sent back to Great Britain. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 represented a turning point in military attitudes toward shell shock. The offensive, which began on July 1, 1916, resulted in nearly 60,000 British casualties on the first day alone. Among these casualties, shell shock cases reached epidemic proportions, with some estimates suggesting that as many as 40% of casualties in the Battle of the Somme were shell-shocked, creating an enormous drain on manpower that the British Army could not afford. The scale of psychological casualties forced military authorities to reconsider their evacuation policies. Forward psychiatric units for the rapid treatment of shell shock were established, with patients treated in centres within hearing distance of the frontline guns and with the expectation of prompt recovery. The goal was no longer primarily medical care, but rather the rapid return of soldiers to active duty. The treatment approaches that emerged during this period reflected the fundamental uncertainty about shell shock's nature. At one extreme were doctors who believed in physical treatments designed to shock patients back to normalcy. At the other were pioneering psychiatrists who advocated for psychological approaches based on understanding and empathy. The most infamous advocate of physical treatment was Dr. Lewis Yealland, a Canadian-born physician working at the National Hospital for the Paralysed and Epileptic at Queen Square in London. Yealland did not consider shell shock an illness, believing instead that men showing such symptoms displayed a lack of discipline or sense of duty. He practiced a form of therapy based on punishment and claimed a success rate of 100%. Yealland's methods were brutal by any standard. In his 1918 book, Hysterical Disorders of Warfare, he described treating a patient suffering from mutism. After 9 months of unsuccessful treatments, including electric shocks to the neck, cigarettes put out on his tongue, and hot plates placed at the back of his mouth, Yealland reported telling the patient, "You will not leave this room until you are talking as well as you ever did. No, not before. You must behave as the hero I expect you to be." He then applied an electric shock to the throat so strong that it sent the patient reeling backwards, unhooking the battery from the machine. When the patient broke free from the electrical apparatus, Yealland simply strapped him down to prevent further interruptions and continued the treatment. After what Yealland described as an hour of electrical treatment, the patient finally whispered his first words. Yealland reported this encounter triumphantly, believing it proved that shell shock was a disease of manhood rather than an illness that came from witnessing, being subjected to, and partaking in incredible violence. His approach was based on the theory that shell shock represented a failure of masculine will that could be corrected through sufficient application of pain and authority. Yealland's treatment approach integrated peripheral and central electrical stimulation with a variety of other psychological and physical interventions. A combination of electrical stimulation of affected muscles with suggestion of imminent improvement was the hallmark of his approach. He worked alongside Edgar Adrian, who would later win the Nobel Prize for his research on neurons, and together they developed what they called an intensive electrotherapeutic treatment. Adrian and Yealland considered that the pain accompanying the use of electrical current was necessary for both therapeutic and disciplinary reasons, especially because of their suspicion of malingering. Their methods were similar to the torpillage techniques being used by French physicians, who believed that the shock of electrical treatment could literally shock patients back to normal function. The theoretical foundation for such treatments lay in the prevailing understanding of hysteria and nervous disorders. Many doctors believed that shell shock was essentially a form of male hysteria, and hysteria had traditionally been treated through physical interventions designed to overcome the patient's resistance to normal function. The idea that pain could be therapeutic was not new. It had been used to treat various nervous conditions for decades. Yet even Yealland's apparent successes were questionable. Although his reported success rates were high, Yealland conducted no formal follow-up studies. There was no systematic attempt to determine whether patients who had been cured through electrical treatment remained functional once they returned to combat or civilian life. The definition of success was narrowly focused on the immediate cessation of symptoms, with no consideration of long-term outcomes. At the other end of the treatment spectrum stood Dr. William Halsey Rivers, whose approach to shell shock represented a radical departure from conventional medical thinking. Rivers was a well-read psychologist already familiar with the work of Freud, Jung, and other psychoanalysts when he was assigned to treat shell shock cases. His methods were based on understanding rather than punishment, on exploration rather than suppression. Rivers worked first at W.H.R Hospital, which was known as the Center for Abnormal Psychology, where many physicians were employing techniques such as dream interpretation, psychoanalysis, and hypnosis to treat shell shock. Later, he was transferred to Craiglockhart Hospital near Edinburgh, a former luxury spa that had been converted into a treatment facility for officers suffering from nervous disorders. Craiglockhart represented a revolutionary approach to treating shell shock. The hospital was nicknamed Dottyville by patients, but it offered a regime of sports, gardening, hobbies, language classes, botany, a debating society, and importantly, talking therapies. Rather than trying to shock patients back to normalcy, Rivers and his colleagues created an environment designed to help men process their traumatic experiences. For traumatic hysteria, Rivers mainly used suggestion, persuasion, re-education, and hypnosis. For anxiety neurosis, more typical in officers returning with shell shock, Rivers used autognosis, a two-part process. The first involved educating the patient in psychology and physiology, helping him to realize that the illness he was experiencing was neither strange nor permanent. The second part was talk therapy, which helped patients find ways to deal with patterns of neurological disturbances. Rivers' approach was based on his belief that shell shock resulted from the repression of traumatic memories. He saw the instinct of self-preservation as the driving force behind shell shock, believing that memories were repressed because there was a conflict between the mental tendencies of the individual and the traditional code of conduct prescribed by society. In other words, soldiers broke down because they were forced to suppress their natural human responses to life-threatening situations. The talking cure that Rivers pioneered was revolutionary for its time. Most medical treatments focused on suppressing symptoms or forcing patients to behave normally. Rivers instead encouraged patients to explore their traumatic experiences, to understand them, and to integrate them into their sense of self. This approach required a fundamental shift in thinking about mental illness, from viewing it as a failure of character to seeing it as an understandable response to extraordinary circumstances. Rivers' most famous patient was Siegfried Sassoon, a decorated officer and poet who had been sent to Craiglockhart not because of shell shock, but because of his public protest against the continuation of the war. The government faced a dilemma with Sassoon, who had served conscientiously from the outbreak of war and won a military cross for bravery in 1916. Rather than court-martial him, which might have drawn attention to his anti-war views, they ordered him to be found suffering from shell shock and sent to Craiglockhart. Sassoon described Rivers in a letter to his friend Robert Graves. "My reasoning Rivers ran solemnly in, with peace in the pools of his spectacled eyes, and a wisely omnipotent grin, and I fished in that steady grey stream and decided that I, after all, am no longer the worm that refuses to die. The relationship between Rivers and Sassoon would become one of the most documented doctor-patient relationships in medical history, immortalized in literature, and serving as an example of compassionate psychiatric care. Another patient at Craiglockhart was Wilfred Owen, who would become one of the most celebrated poets of the war. Owen's time at the hospital allowed him to process his traumatic experiences through writing, creating some of the most powerful anti-war poetry ever written. The hospital's literary magazine, The Hydra, provided an outlet for patients to express their experiences and connect with one another. The contrast between Yealland's and Rivers' approaches reflected a broader debate within the medical profession about the nature of shell shock and how it should be treated. Unlike Yealland's physical methods, Rivers' psychological approaches not only got troops back to the front line, but those they treated were far less likely to break down again under fire. The evidence suggested that understanding and processing traumatic experiences was more effective than trying to suppress or ignore them. Yet Rivers himself struggled with the ethical implications of his work. His job was not simply to heal his patients, but to make them fit to return to combat. He was, in effect, helping to send men back to the very experiences that had traumatized them in the first place. This contradiction caused Rivers considerable personal anguish and may have contributed to his own psychological difficulties later in life. The debate over shell shock was not merely academic. It had life and death consequences for the men affected. The military's confusion about the condition led to wildly inconsistent responses. Some shell shock sufferers received medical treatment and support. Others faced court-martial and execution for cowardice or desertion. The case of Private Harry Farr exemplifies the tragic consequences of this confusion. Farr had joined the British Expeditionary Force in 1914 and was sent to France, where in May 1915 he collapsed, shaking, and was hospitalized for treatment. He returned to the battlefield and participated in the Somme offensive, but in September 1916 refused to advance into the trenches with his squadron. After being dragged forward and breaking away to run back, Farr was court-martialed for cowardice and sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad on October 18, 1916. Farr was very likely experiencing intense fear and was probably suffering from an illness like anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, according to modern medical analysis of his case. Farr was not alone. In total, 266 British soldiers were executed for desertion, 18 for cowardice, 7 for quitting a post without authority, 5 for disobedience to a lawful command, and 2 for casting away arms. The true tragedy is that we will never know how many of these 306 executed soldiers had indeed suffered acute medical incapacity beyond their control, and how many had made a rational decision in a murderously irrational situation. The military's approach to shell shock was further complicated by class distinctions that permeated British society. Symptoms were generally classified into 2 groups: neurasthenic reactions, which were thought to be more likely to affect officers, and hysterical reactions, which were more common among private soldiers. This classification reflected prevailing social assumptions about the supposed superiority of the officer class and their greater ability to withstand stress. Officers diagnosed with shell shock were more likely to receive compassionate treatment and be sent to hospitals like Craiglockhart. There were 6 special hospitals established for officers and 16 for other ranks, and the quality of care differed significantly between them. Officers were seen as valuable assets whose breakdown represented a temporary malfunction that could be repaired. Enlisted men were more likely to be viewed as expendable and their breakdown as evidence of inherent weakness. The stigma associated with shell shock extended far beyond medical classification. Many viewed shell shock with skepticism, speculating that those affected were faking the condition to get out of having to fight. This suspicion was reinforced by the visible nature of many shell shock symptoms, which seemed to outside observers like deliberate performances rather than genuine medical conditions. The suspicion of malingering was not entirely unfounded. Some soldiers undoubtedly did attempt to fake shell shock symptoms to escape the horrors of trench warfare. However, the assumption that shell shock was primarily a problem of weak character rather than genuine trauma led to tragic misunderstandings and inappropriate treatments. Military authorities were particularly concerned about the potential for shell shock to spread through the ranks. The British Medical Journal described shell shock as a catching complaint, suggesting that knowledge of the condition might cause it to spread like a contagion. This fear led to policies designed to minimize discussion of shell shock and to treat affected soldiers in ways that would discourage others from developing similar symptoms. The reality of trench warfare made such policies increasingly difficult to maintain. The Western Front was a psychological assault on human sanity unlike anything previously experienced in warfare. Men lived for months in flooded trenches, surrounded by mud rats and the decomposing bodies of their comrades. They faced constant danger from sniper fire, artillery bombardment, and poison gas attacks. The stress was not limited to periods of active combat. The threat of death was constant, creating a state of perpetual anxiety that wore down even the strongest men. One veteran described the psychological impact: the strain of continual bombardment. Continual, not just one bomb and then a quarter of an hour and another one, but continual bombardment all the time, pounding and pounding away. Now, I think that's what people didn't understand. They heard of people having shell shock, but what happened was everybody had shell shock who went through that sort of thing. It manifested itself in different ways. The recognition that shell shock was a universal response to extreme stress, rather than evidence of individual weakness, represented a fundamental shift in understanding. Yet this shift was slow and incomplete. Military authorities remained focused on maintaining discipline and returning men to combat effectiveness, often at the expense of genuine healing. The challenge of treating shell shock was compounded by the limited understanding of psychology and psychiatry in the early 20th century. The condition was poorly understood medically and psychologically, and only a comparatively few medical men prior to the war had had an opportunity of becoming thoroughly familiar with this very distinct branch of medicine. Most doctors treating shell shock cases had no specialized training in mental health and were forced to improvise treatments based on their understanding of physical medicine. The lack of understanding led to a proliferation of experimental treatments. Electric heat baths, milk diets, hypnotism, clamps, and machines that mechanically forced stubborn limbs out of their frozen positions were among the strategies employed. Some patients were subjected to cold water treatments, forced exercise regimens, or isolation therapy. The variation in treatment approaches reflected the desperation of doctors faced with a condition they did not understand. The development of specialized shell shock hospitals represented an important advance in treatment, even if the care provided was often inadequate. There were so many officers and men with shell shock that 19 British military hospitals were wholly devoted to the treatment of cases. These hospitals allowed for the concentration of expertise and the development of more systematic treatment approaches. One of the most innovative treatment centres was established by Dr. Arthur Hurst at Seal Hain Hospital in Devon. Hurst pioneered revolutionary treatments for war neurosis, believing in occupational therapy. The men worked on a farm in the peace of the countryside and were given intensive therapy sessions, including hypnosis. 90% of his patients were cured. Hurst's approach was based on the idea that shell shock patients needed to reconnect with normal life activities and regain confidence in their abilities. The farm work provided both physical exercise and a sense of purpose. while the rural setting offered a peaceful contrast to the chaos of the trenches. Hirst wanted to encourage patients to reconstruct their trauma and confront their memories, emphasizing the cognitive and behavioral symptoms which individuals experience. The filming of shell shock cases before and after treatment became an important tool for both research and demonstration. These early medical films provide a haunting visual record of the condition's effects and the various treatment approaches employed. The films captured 21 patients with various presumed psychogenic manifestations, showing symptoms ranging from gait disorders and tremor to dystonia and retrograde amnesia. The films revealed the dramatic nature of many shell shock symptoms and the sometimes equally dramatic improvements following treatment. However, they also raised questions about the sustainability of these improvements and the methods used to achieve them. Many patients appeared to recover completely within days or even hours of beginning treatment, but there was little follow-up to determine whether these recoveries were lasting. The question of malingering remained a constant concern throughout the war. Military authorities were convinced that some men were faking shell shock symptoms to avoid combat duty. This suspicion was reinforced by the dramatic nature of many symptoms and the sometimes rapid recoveries following treatment. However, distinguishing between genuine shell shock and malingering proved extremely difficult in practice. As Medical Officer William Collins of the Royal Army Medical Corps explained, "I never saw a panicky soldier. I saw them when their nerves had broken and given way. I mean, they were just laying, gibbering idiots. I've seen a soldier laying on a stretcher, gibbering like an idiot just from the shell shock, being blown unconscious. As a rule, they were either charged with malingering or sent down to hospital, and at depth the diagnosis of shell shock could have profound implications for a soldier's future. The arbitrary nature of these classifications meant that identical cases might be treated completely differently depending on which medical officers were involved. This inconsistency reflected the fundamental confusion about shell shock that persisted throughout the war. Medical knowledge was advancing rapidly, but institutional attitudes changed much more slowly. The case histories that survive from shell shock hospitals provide glimpse into the individual human stories behind the medical statistics. Consider the case of 27-year-old rifleman Frank D., who was admitted to Queen's Square on May 4, 1915, with a diagnosis of functional tremor and neurosis like dog chorea. The case record reads, "Patient is a territorial and went out to France in January. He has been quite well up till a week ago, when on April 26th, he was buried under a bomb explosion in the trench. He was not unconscious, but dazed, and all in a tremble. All his limbs were shaking. He was conscious, being carried by his comrades out of the trenches to a dugout. A few hours afterwards, he had to cry, and he was crying for 2 days." The humanity evident in such records contrasts sharply with the often mechanical approaches to treatment. Frank D. was a real person with a name, a history, and a story. He had been functioning normally until a specific traumatic event overwhelmed his capacity to cope. His breakdown was not evidence of inherent weakness, but rather a comprehensible response to an incomprehensible situation. Yet the medical system of the time struggled to see shell shock patients as individuals rather than problems to be solved. The pressure to return men to active duty as quickly as possible meant that treatment was often focused on symptom suppression rather than genuine healing. Success was measured not by the patient's long-term well-being, but by his ability to return to military service. The development of forward treatment centers represented an attempt to balance medical and military concerns. By treating shell shock cases close to the front lines, doctors hoped to maintain the connection between the patient and his unit while providing necessary medical care. The proximity to combat was thought to prevent patients from becoming too comfortable with their removal from danger. This approach was based on 5 key principles developed by American physician Thomas W. Salmon: immediacy, proximity, expectancy, simplicity, and centrality. Immediacy meant treating as early as possible, before acute stress was succeeded by chronic symptoms. Proximity meant treating the patient near the front line, within hearing distance of the battle din. Expectancy referred to the positive expectation of prompt recovery and return to duty. Simplicity meant avoiding complex diagnostic procedures that might delay treatment. Centrality referred to the centralized coordination of treatment approaches. These principles would prove influential in the treatment of combat stress in subsequent conflicts, but their application in World War I was often problematic. The expectation of prompt recovery put enormous pressure on both patients and doctors, while the proximity to combat meant that patients were constantly reminded of the source of their trauma. The arbitrary nature of shell shock diagnoses created significant inequalities in treatment and compensation. A man who was labeled as having been wounded by enemy action received not only medical care, but also a pension and the right to wear a wound stripe. A man whose breakdown was attributed to sickness received no such benefits and might face suspicion of cowardice or malingering. These distinctions had profound implications for the families of shell shock sufferers. The wives and children of men labeled as wounded received continuing financial support. The families of men labeled as sick often faced poverty and social stigma. The psychological pressure on shell shock sufferers was thus compounded by economic anxiety and social shame. The question of pensions for shell shock cases remained contentious throughout and after the war. By 1939, some 120,000 British ex-servicemen had received final awards for primary psychiatric disability, or were still drawing pensions, about 15% of all pensioned disabilities. Another 44,000 or so were receiving pensions for soldier's heart or effort syndrome. Yet these statistics represented only the tip of a much larger iceberg. Many men who suffered from shell shock never received any official recognition or support. The stigma associated with mental breakdown meant that countless veterans suffered in silence rather than seek help that might not be available anyway. The war's end brought new challenges for shell shock sufferers. 15,000 men were still in hospital with shell shock in 1921, 3 years after the armistice. The problem of shell shock did not end with the cessation of hostilities. If anything, it became more complex as society struggled to understand and support veterans whose wounds were invisible. Veterans returning from the war faced a civilian population that had little understanding of what they had experienced. The gap between military and civilian life had never been wider. Men who had lived through the industrial nightmare of the Western Front found themselves expected to readjust to peacetime society as if nothing had happened. Many veterans discovered that their families and communities were uncomfortable with their changed mental state. Physical wounds were comprehensible and could be honored as evidence of sacrifice for country. Mental wounds were mysterious and troubling, often seen as evidence of weakness rather than service. Some veterans found that their shell shock symptoms actually worsened after returning home. The structure and purpose provided by military life, however horrific, had given meaning to their suffering. Civilian life often seemed pointless and trivial by comparison. As one observer noted, they put on civilian clothes again and looked to their mothers and wives very much like the young men who had gone to business in the peaceful days before August 1914, but they had not come back the same men. Something had altered in them. They were subject to sudden moods and queer tempers, fits of profound depression, alternating with a restless desire for pleasure. The long-term effects of shell shock were often devastating. Veterans reported persistent nightmares, sudden panic attacks triggered by unexpected noises, and an inability to form normal relationships. Many turned to alcohol or other substances to numb their psychological pain. Suicide rates among veterans were elevated, though exact statistics are difficult to determine due to the stigma associated with both shell shock and suicide. The children of shell shock sufferers were also affected. Thomas Olive's testimony reveals the intergenerational impact. "My daughter, incidentally, is terribly nervous. She's terribly nervous. My wife says it's all my fault. Well, I had shell shock, you see. I got blown up, you see, and it affected my whole system." The families of shell shock sufferers often became secondary victims of the condition. Wives reported being frightened by their husbands' nighttime episodes. Children grew up in households marked by unpredictable moods and emotional volatility. The ripple effects of shell shock extended far beyond the individual veteran. The medical understanding of shell shock continued to evolve throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The War Office Committee of Inquiry into Shell Shock, established in 1922, attempted to synthesize the lessons learned during the war. The committee concluded that the term shell shock was wholly misleading, but acknowledged that it had become too entrenched in public consciousness to be abandoned. The committee's recommendations emphasized the importance of morale, training, and leadership in preventing shell shock. They suggested that every possible means should be taken to promote morale, esprit de corps, and a high standard of discipline, and that training should be sufficiently prolonged to ensure that the soldier is not only physically fit and efficient, but also that he has had time to acquire such a standard of morale as will enable him to put the welfare of his unit before his own personal safety. These recommendations reflected a continued belief that shell shock was primarily a problem of character and preparation rather than an inevitable consequence of exposure to extreme stress. The committee was reluctant to acknowledge that even the strongest and best trained soldiers might break down under sufficient pressure. The committee also emphasized the importance of early identification and treatment of shell shock symptoms. They recommended that close observation should be made by officers, both regimental and medical, and by non-commissioned officers of the unit on individuals during the whole of their training, so that abnormalities from which mental or nervous instability may be inferred may not be overlooked. This focus on early identification reflected a growing understanding that shell shock was often preceded by warning signs that could be recognized and addressed before complete breakdown occurred. However, the practical application of such recommendations was complicated by the demands of warfare and the limited understanding of mental health among military personnel. The committee's treatment recommendations were more progressive, emphasizing that the establishment of an atmosphere of cure is the basis of all successful treatment, and that the personality of the physician is, therefore, of the greatest importance. They endorsed the simplest forms of psychotherapy, i.e., explanation, persuasion, and suggestion, aided by such physical methods as baths, electricity, and massage. However, the committee explicitly rejected psychoanalysis in the Freudian sense, reflecting the continued resistance to more complex psychological explanations for shell shock. The medical establishment was willing to acknowledge that shell shock was real, but remained uncomfortable with theories that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The international dimension of shell shock reveals interesting differences in how various nations approached the problem. The German armies continued to send troops back to Germany, where they were generally treated in large hospitals, though work-based therapies were developed from 1915. The German approach emphasized the importance of returning patients to productive activity as quickly as possible. The Austro-Hungarian armies centralized their treatment in Vienna, and by the end of the war, there were approximately 120,000 shell-shocked soldiers in the capital. This concentration of cases in a single location created unique opportunities for research and treatment development, but also highlighted the massive scale of the problem. French physicians developed their own approaches to shell shock treatment, including the torpillage technique that influenced British doctors like Yealland and Adrian. French military psychiatry emphasized the importance of maintaining discipline while providing medical care, leading to treatments that combine therapeutic and punitive elements. The American approach to shell shock was influenced by the relatively late entry of the United States into the war. American medical authorities had the opportunity to study British and French experiences before developing their own policies. Dr. Thomas Salmon's recommendations for forward treatment and psychological screening of recruits reflected lessons learned from Allied experiences. The American emphasis on screening potential recruits for psychological vulnerabilities represented an important development in military psychiatry. The idea that shell shock might be prevented through careful selection of personnel offered hope that future conflicts might avoid the massive psychological casualties of World War I. However, the screening approach was based on flawed assumptions about the nature of psychological breakdown. The tests used to identify potentially vulnerable recruits were primitive and often reflected social prejudices rather than genuine psychological insights. Men were rejected for service based on criteria that had little relationship to their actual ability to withstand combat stress. The shell shock experience during World War I also revealed important insights about the relationship between civilian and military psychology. War psychiatry did not develop in isolation from civilian psychiatry, and throughout the war, military psychiatry drew from concepts in the civilian world where there had been much medical investigation into mental trauma since the late 19th century. The phenomenon of railway spine had been observed among passengers and workmen involved in railway accidents, who often suffered from symptoms such as partial paralysis, headaches, backache, dizziness, and loss of memory, none of which seemed directly related to the initial impact or physical shock. The similarity between railway spine and shell shock symptoms suggested that both conditions might represent responses to traumatic stress rather than specific physical injuries. The term neurasthenia had been coined in 1869 by American physician George Beard to describe patients suffering from a range of physical and mental symptoms such as headaches, impotence, anxiety, paralysis, neuralgia, depression, and loss of memory. Beard attributed neurasthenia to the nerve damage caused by the strain of modern, highly competitive urban life. The concept of neurasthenia provided a framework for understanding shell shock as a response to the stresses of modern life, including modern warfare. The precedent of nostalgia in earlier conflicts also provided important context for understanding shell shock. During the American Civil War, military doctors were perplexed that men could die not just of wounds or disease, but also of what they called nostalgia, a contagious condition associated with morbid homesickness. Nostalgia became an epidemic as the war dragged on, accounting for more cases than dysentery. The Swiss physician Johannes Hofer had first coined the term nostalgia in 1678 to describe Swiss soldiers who suffered from despair and homesickness, as well as classic symptoms like sleeplessness and anxiety. German, French, and Spanish doctors described similar illnesses in their military patients around the same time, suggesting that psychological responses to military service were not unique to the industrial warfare of the 20th century. However, the scale and severity of shell shock during World War I represented something genuinely new in human experience. The industrialized nature of the conflict created psychological stresses that were qualitatively different from those experienced in previous wars. The mechanized slaughter of the Western Front overwhelmed traditional coping mechanisms and created forms of trauma that existing medical knowledge was inadequate to address. The role of artillery bombardment in producing shell shock cannot be understated. The Western Front saw the deployment of artillery on a scale never before imagined. During major offensives, thousands of guns would fire simultaneously, creating barrages that could be heard across entire countries. The psychological impact of such bombardments was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans described the sensation of being under artillery bombardment as unlike anything in civilian experience. The earth shook continuously, the air filled with choking smoke and dust, and the noise was so intense that it seemed to penetrate not just the ears, but the entire body. Men reported feeling as if their very souls were being battered by the relentless pounding of the guns. The random nature of artillery casualties added to the psychological stress. A shell might land in a crowded trench and kill a dozen men, while leaving their neighbor completely unharmed. There was no logic to survival, no way to predict who would live and who would die. This randomness created a sense of helplessness and fatalism that wore down even the strongest men. The sight of artillery casualties was particularly traumatic. High explosive shells could completely obliterate human bodies, leaving behind only scattered fragments. Veterans reported being haunted by memories of trying to collect the remains of their comrades after direct hits. The dehumanizing nature of such experiences challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, honor, and meaning. The development of poison gas as a weapon added another dimension to the psychological horror of the Western Front. Gas attacks created panic in a way that conventional weapons did not. The invisible nature of gas, the terrifying suffocation it caused, and the horrible deaths of gas casualties all contributed to the psychological burden carried by the troops. Veterans of gas attacks often developed specific phobias and anxieties related to breathing and enclosed spaces. The experience of being trapped in a gas cloud, unable to see or breathe properly, fighting to get a gas mask on while watching comrades die horribly around them, created lasting psychological scars that were distinct from those caused by conventional weapons. The machine gun was another weapon that created unique psychological stresses. The mechanical nature of machine gun fire, its ability to cut down large numbers of men in seconds, and the helplessness soldiers felt when facing it all contributed to shell shock. Veterans reported being haunted by the distinctive sound of machine gun fire, developing startled responses to any rapid, repetitive noise. The psychological impact of witnessing death on an industrial scale was perhaps the most significant factor in the development of shell shock. Previous wars had certainly been deadly, but the Western Front represented death on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. Veterans reported seeing thousands of bodies in a single day, watching entire units wiped out in minutes, and living surrounded by decomposing corpses for weeks at a time. The dehumanizing effect of such experiences cannot be overstated. Men reported feeling as if they had ceased to be human, as if they had become machines designed only for killing and survival. The normal emotional responses to death and suffering became impossible to maintain in the face of such overwhelming carnage. The role of leadership in either preventing or exacerbating shell shock became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Units with good officers who cared for their men and maintained morale had lower rates of shell shock. Units with poor leadership, where men felt abandoned or uncared for, experienced higher rates of breakdown. Yet even the best leadership could not prevent shell shock entirely. Some of the most respected and capable officers in the British Army themselves suffered breakdowns. This reality forced a recognition that shell shock was not simply a problem of weak character or poor leadership, but rather an inevitable consequence of the unprecedented stresses of modern warfare. The development of shell shock hospitals created specialized environments for treatment, but also institutionalized the segregation of mentally wounded veterans from the rest of society. These hospitals were often located in remote areas, far from the gaze of the public. Patients were transported separately from physically wounded men and were often hidden away from ordinary nursing staff. The segregation reflected society's discomfort with mental illness, but it also served to isolate shell shock sufferers from potential sources of understanding and support. The isolation reinforced the sense that shell shock was shameful, something to be hidden rather than acknowledged and treated openly. Some hospitals attempted to create more normal environments for their patients. Lennell House, a private convalescent home for officers in the Scottish borders, was established on a country estate that included farms and woodlands. Before the war, Lennell was celebrated for having the finest Italianate gardens in Britain. The estate was transformed into a treatment centre where shell shock patients could recover in peaceful surroundings. The use of country estates and rural locations for shell shock treatment reflected a belief that contact with nature was therapeutic. Doctors observed that patients often improved when removed from military environments and placed in peaceful, natural settings. This observation would later influence the development of occupational therapy and other treatment approaches that emphasized the importance of environment in healing. The literary response to shell shock provides another lens through which to understand its impact. The war produced an unprecedented flowering of poetry, much of it written by officers who had experienced shell shock or witnessed its effects. Poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen used their writing to process traumatic experiences and to communicate the reality of shell shock to a civilian population that struggled to understand it. Owen's poem, Mental Cases, provides a haunting description of shell shock sufferers. Who are these? Why sit they here in twilight? Wherefore rock they, purgatorial shadows, drooping tongues from jaws that slob their relish, baring teeth that leer like skulls' teeth, wicked. The poem captures both the horror of shell shock symptoms and the dehumanizing way they were often perceived by others. Sassoon's poetry also dealt extensively with shell shock, both his own experiences and those of the men he commanded. His poem, Repression of War Experience, was directly inspired by Rivers' psychological theories and provided a poetic exploration of the mental processes involved in trauma and recovery. The use of literature as both a symptom of shell shock and a treatment for it represents an important development in understanding trauma. The act of writing about traumatic experiences provided a way for veterans to process and communicate their suffering. Reading the work of other veterans provided validation and connection for men who felt isolated by their experiences. The establishment of patient magazines in shell shock hospitals, such as the Hydra at Craiglockhart, created opportunities for therapeutic expression and community building. These publications allowed patients to share their experiences, explore their feelings, and maintain connections with the outside world. The therapeutic value of creative expression would become an important element in later approaches to trauma treatment. The role of music and sound in shell shock treatment also reveals important insights about the condition. Patients at Craiglockhart participated in weekly musical entertainments, including singing, playing instruments, and listening, as part of Captain Arthur Brock's Cure by Functioning regime. Music provided both emotional expression and social connection, elements that were crucial for recovery. However, sound could also be a source of continued trauma for shell shock sufferers. Many veterans developed extreme sensitivity to loud noises, particularly sounds that reminded them of artillery bombardment. The backfiring of a car engine, the slamming of a door, or even the sound of thunder could trigger panic attacks and flashbacks. the hypersensitivity to sound experienced by many shell shock sufferers reveals important information about the neurological basis of the condition. Recent research has shown that exposure to explosive blasts can cause actual physical damage to the brain, particularly in areas responsible for processing sensory information and regulating emotional responses. This neurological research provides new insights into historical cases of shell shock. What early 20th century doctors interpreted as purely psychological symptoms may have had significant biological components. The tremors, paralysis, and sensory disorders experienced by shell shock patients may have resulted from actual brain injuries caused by exposure to explosive forces. Research conducted by Johns Hopkins University found that the brain tissue of combat veterans exposed to improvised explosive devices exhibited a pattern of injury in areas responsible for decision-making, memory, and reasoning. The symptoms exhibited by these modern veterans are remarkably similar to those described in historical accounts of shell shock, suggesting continuity between past and present manifestations of combat trauma. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency opened a $10 million study of blast effects on the human brain, revealing that while the brain remains intact immediately after low-level blast effects, chronic inflammation afterwards ultimately leads to many cases of shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder. This research suggests that the original theory linking shell shock to artillery bombardment may have been partially correct, even if the mechanism was not understood at the time. The relationship between shell shock and class became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Officers were more likely to be diagnosed with neurasthenia, which was considered a more respectable condition. Enlisted men were more likely to be diagnosed with hysteria, which carried greater stigma and was associated with moral weakness. This class-based approach to diagnosis reflected broader social assumptions about the inherent superiority of the upper classes and their greater capacity to withstand stress. Officers were seen as naturally more resilient, so their breakdowns were attributed to external factors beyond their control. Enlisted men were seen as naturally weaker, so their breakdowns were attributed to internal character flaws. The differential treatment of officers and enlisted men with shell shock created significant inequalities in care and outcomes. Officers were more likely to be sent to hospitals like Craiglockhart, where they received innovative psychological treatments. Enlisted men were more likely to be subjected to harsh disciplinary treatments designed to force them back to duty as quickly as possible. The class distinctions in shell shock treatment reflected broader inequalities in British society, but they also revealed important insights about the relationship between social support and recovery from trauma. Officers who had higher social status and more resources generally had better outcomes than enlisted men, who faced greater stigma and had fewer options for treatment and support. The role of shame and stigma in shell shock cannot be overstated. Many soldiers went to extraordinary lengths to hide their symptoms from their comrades and superiors. The fear of being labeled a coward often prevented men from seeking help until their condition had become severe and chronic. The stigma was reinforced by military policies that treated shell shock as a disciplinary issue rather than a medical one. Courts martial often failed to distinguish between shell shock and cowardice, leading to harsh punishments for men who were suffering from genuine medical conditions. The threat of execution for cowardice created enormous pressure on shell shock sufferers to conceal their symptoms and attempt to function normally despite their disabilities. The problem of distinguishing between genuine shell shock and malingering remained contentious throughout the war. Military authorities were convinced that some men were faking symptoms to avoid combat duty, while medical professionals argued that the majority of cases were genuine. The inability to develop reliable diagnostic criteria made it nearly impossible to resolve this debate definitively. The suspicion of malingering was exacerbated by the dramatic nature of many shell shock symptoms and the sometimes rapid recoveries following treatment. Critics pointed to cases where men who had been completely mute or paralyzed for months suddenly recovered their abilities after a single treatment session. Such rapid improvements seemed to support the theory that shell shock was largely voluntary and could be overcome through sufficient motivation. However, defenders of shell shock patients argued that the dramatic nature of symptoms and rapid recoveries actually supported the psychological rather than physical theory of the condition. If shell shock were caused by physical brain damage, they reasoned, symptoms would not appear and disappear so quickly. The fact that psychological treatments could produce rapid improvements suggested that the condition was indeed psychological in nature. The question of malingering was further complicated by the fact that many genuine shell shock sufferers also engaged in some degree of conscious exaggeration of their symptoms. Men who were genuinely traumatized might emphasize or prolong their symptoms to avoid returning to combat. This conscious component did not negate the reality of their underlying trauma, but it made diagnosis and treatment more complex. The development of occupational therapy as a treatment for shell shock represented an important advance in understanding trauma recovery. Doctors observed that patients who were kept busy with meaningful activities recovered more quickly than those who were simply left to rest. The engagement in productive work provided both distraction from traumatic memories and evidence of returning capability. Agricultural work was particularly favored as a form of occupational therapy. The physical activity involved in farming provided exercise and fresh air, while the natural environment was thought to have inherently healing properties. The cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting also provided a sense of purpose and continuity that was absent from military life. Yet this observation about the immediate effectiveness of occupational therapy approaches suggested that shell shock recovery required more than just the cessation of symptoms. It required the rebuilding of a sense of normal human functioning. Based on what we know from treatment records, patients needed to relearn how to engage with the world in constructive rather than destructive ways. The use of creative activities as therapy also proved valuable. Patients who engaged in writing, music, art, or crafts often showed significant improvement in their symptoms. These activities provided both emotional expression and cognitive stimulation, helping patients to process their experiences and reconnect with aspects of themselves that had been suppressed during combat. The therapeutic value of creative expression during shell shock treatment would later influence the development of art therapy and other expressive therapies for trauma. The recognition that creativity could serve as both a symptom of recovery and a means of achieving it represented an important insight into the relationship between art and mental health. The social response to shell shock revealed deep anxieties about masculinity, courage, and social order. The sight of strong young men reduced to trembling, mute shadows of their former selves challenged fundamental assumptions about male strength and heroism. Society struggled to understand how men who had volunteered to serve their country could be broken by that service. The gendered nature of shell shock was particularly troubling to contemporary observers. The symptoms often resembled those traditionally associated with female hysteria, paralysis, mutism, and emotional volatility. The idea that warfare could feminize men threatened basic assumptions about the relationship between military service and masculine identity. This anxiety about the feminizing effects of shell shock influenced both medical treatment and social attitudes. Treatments often focused on restoring masculine characteristics, strength, self-control, and emotional stoicism. The goal was not just to cure symptoms, but to restore patients to an acceptable form of masculinity. The fear that shell shock might undermine traditional masculine virtues extended beyond individual cases to broader concerns about social stability. If the finest young men of the nation could be broken by military service, what did this say about the nation's strength and character? These concerns influenced government policies and shaped public discourse about shell shock throughout and after the war. The religious and spiritual dimensions of shell shock also deserve attention. Many veterans struggled with questions of meaning and purpose in the aftermath of their traumatic experiences. The senseless slaughter of the Western Front challenged traditional beliefs about divine providence, moral order, and the meaning of suffering. Some shell shock patients found comfort in religious faith, seeing their survival as evidence of divine protection. Others lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their experiences with beliefs about a benevolent God. The spiritual crisis experienced by many veterans was often as profound as their psychological trauma. Military chaplains played an important role in supporting shell shock sufferers, though their effectiveness was limited by their dual loyalty to military authorities and their pastoral duties. Some chaplains became advocates for more humane treatment of shell shock patients, while others reinforced military expectations of courage and duty. The impact of shell shock on military chaplains themselves was also significant. These men were exposed to the same traumatic experiences as the soldiers they served, but were expected to maintain faith and provide comfort in the face of apparently meaningless suffering. Many chaplains themselves developed shell shock symptoms, though they were often reluctant to seek treatment due to their professional responsibilities. The evolutionary understanding of shell shock continued to develop throughout the 1920s and 1930s. By the mid-1920s, more sophisticated psychological theories had emerged that viewed shell shock as a normal response to abnormal circumstances rather than evidence of character weakness. This shift in understanding was gradual and incomplete, but it represented an important step toward more humane and effective treatment approaches. The work of civilian psychiatrists and psychologists during this period contributed significantly to the evolving understanding of trauma. Figures like Abram Cardiner, who worked with World War I veterans in the United States, developed new theories about the psychological mechanisms underlying traumatic disorders. Cardiner's book, The Traumatic Neuroses of War, provided a more empathetic framework for understanding combat trauma as psychological injury rather than character failure. The influence of Freudian psychoanalysis on shell shock treatment was complex and controversial. While some doctors like Rivers incorporated psychoanalytic insights into their work, the military medical establishment generally resisted Freudian approaches. The emphasis on sexuality in Freudian theory was seen as inappropriate for military settings, and the lengthy analytical process was incompatible with the need for rapid treatment and return to duty. However, certain psychoanalytic concepts proved valuable in understanding shell shock. The idea that traumatic memories could be repressed and that bringing them to consciousness might be therapeutic influenced the development of talking cures and other psychological approaches. The recognition that symptoms might serve psychological functions rather than representing simple medical problems also derived partly from psychoanalytic insights. The relationship between shell shock and dreams became an important area of investigation. Many shell shock sufferers reported persistent nightmares that replayed their traumatic experiences with terrifying vividness. These dreams often continued for years after the war, suggesting that the psychological processing of trauma was a long-term process rather than something that could be quickly resolved. The analysis of shell shock dreams provided insights into the mechanisms of traumatic memory. Doctors observed that traumatic memories seemed to be stored differently from normal memories, remaining vivid and emotionally charged, long after other memories had faded. This observation would later influence theories about the neurobiology of trauma and the development of specific treatments for traumatic memories. The study of shell shock also revealed important information about the relationship between memory and identity. Many shell shock sufferers experienced partial or complete amnesia for their traumatic experiences, yet the forgotten memories continued to influence their behavior and emotional responses in ways they did not understand. The phenomenon of traumatic amnesia raised profound questions about the nature of memory and consciousness. If experiences could be forgotten, yet continue to exert powerful effects on behavior, what did this say about the relationship between conscious awareness and psychological functioning? These questions would prove central to the development of modern trauma psychology. The economic impact of shell shock extended far beyond the immediate costs of medical treatment. The condition created enormous hidden costs for families and communities as veterans struggled to readjust to civilian life. Many shell shock sufferers were unable to return to their pre-war occupations, requiring retraining or alternative forms of support. The British government failed to provide adequate resources for the retraining of disabled veterans, including those suffering from shell shock. Many families found themselves impoverished by the loss of their primary breadwinner's earning capacity. The economic strain often exacerbated psychological symptoms, creating a vicious cycle of trauma and deprivation. The pension system for shell shock cases was particularly problematic. The distinction between cases due to the enemy and those attributed to sickness meant that many genuine sufferers received no financial support. Even those who did receive pensions often found the amounts inadequate to support themselves and their families. Thomas Olive's experience was typical. I got a pension for about 9 shillings a week. 9 shillings per week was barely enough for subsistence, forcing many shell shock sufferers into poverty and social marginalization. The inadequate support reinforced the perception that shell shock was not a legitimate war injury deserving of societal support. The Ministry of Pensions, established in 1916 to provide compensatory pensions and rehabilitative assistance to disabled veterans, faced enormous challenges in dealing with shell shock cases. By 1921, total war pension spending reached £106 million, totaling 7% of overall government expenditure. Officials feared the potential for incremental growth in government liability and associated costs. In response to these financial pressures, a 7-year time limit on claims was introduced in 1921 as a cost reduction policy. This arbitrary deadline meant that many veterans who developed delayed onset symptoms were denied support. The policy reflected the government's desire to limit long-term financial obligations rather than a medical understanding of trauma recovery. The 7-year limitation particularly affected shell shock sufferers, many of whom experienced delayed or fluctuating symptoms. Some veterans appeared to recover during the war, only to suffer relapses years later. Others developed symptoms only after returning to civilian life, when the structure and purpose of military service was removed, and they were forced to confront their traumatic experiences. The phenomenon of delayed onset shell shock challenged medical understanding of the condition. If shell shock was simply a response to immediate stress, why would symptoms appear years after the triggering events? The observation of delayed onset suggested that trauma had long-term effects on psychological functioning that were not immediately apparent. Modern research has confirmed that delayed onset trauma reactions are indeed common. The psychological processing of extreme experiences can take years or even decades, with symptoms emerging when individuals have the time and safety to confront their experiences. This understanding validates the experiences of many World War I veterans whose symptoms were dismissed because they appeared after the war had ended. The international differences in approaches to shell shock reveal important insights about the relationship between culture and trauma. German military psychiatry emphasized the importance of will and character in overcoming shell shock, reflecting broader cultural values about strength and endurance. German treatments often focused on re-establishing discipline and military bearing rather than exploring psychological mechanisms. French approaches to shell shock were influenced by different cultural attitudes toward emotion and expression. French physicians were more likely to acknowledge the emotional basis of shell shock symptoms, but they also developed harsh treatments like torpillage that combined acknowledgement of psychological causation with punitive therapeutic approaches. The American approach was shaped by different cultural values and by the advantage of learning from European experiences. American physicians placed greater emphasis on prevention through psychological screening and early intervention. The American military was also more willing to acknowledge the legitimacy of psychological casualties, though treatment approaches remained focused on rapid return to duty. These international differences highlight the extent to which shell shock was not just a medical condition, but also a cultural phenomenon. The way shell shock was understood, diagnosed, and treated reflected broader cultural assumptions about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individual and society. The role of social class in shell shock extended beyond differences in diagnosis and treatment to fundamental assumptions about who deserved care and support. Upper-class officers were seen as valuable assets whose breakdown represented a temporary malfunction. Working-class enlisted men were more likely to be seen as expendable, with their breakdown representing evidence of inherent limitations. These class-based assumptions influence not only medical treatment, but also pension policies and post-war support. Officers were more likely to receive generous pensions and access to private treatment facilities. Enlisted men faced greater scrutiny of their claims and were more likely to be denied support. The class dimension of shell shock also reflected broader social tensions about citizenship and entitlement. The war had been fought by men from all social classes, but the benefits of service were not distributed equally. Shell shock became a lens through which to examine these inequalities and their implications for post-war society. The question of women and shell shock provides another important perspective on the condition. While shell shock was primarily diagnosed in male soldiers, women working as nurses, ambulance drivers, and in other support roles also experienced traumatic stress. However, their symptoms were often interpreted differently, reflecting gendered assumptions about mental illness and emotional expression. Women's trauma was more likely to be attributed to their supposedly natural emotional instability rather than to the objective horrors they had witnessed. This gendered interpretation meant that women's war trauma was often trivialized or seen as evidence of their unsuitability for war work rather than as a legitimate response to traumatic experiences. The experience of nurses who worked in shell-shock hospitals was particularly complex. These women were exposed daily to the suffering of traumatized men, yet they were expected to maintain composure and provide care without acknowledging their own emotional responses. Many nurses developed what would now be recognized as secondary trauma from their prolonged exposure to others' suffering. Mrs. Bird, who worked at Colchester Hospital treating shell-shock cases, described the challenging nature of caring for these patients. We had quite a few shell-shock patients, and of course, some who were reliable were allowed to go out on their own, to have tea in the town, and do a bit of shopping. One boy in particular, when I was in the telephone exchange, used to like to come down and talk to us. The sergeant in charge knew this and didn't attempt to stop him in any way. But one day he was missing, and of course the military police had to be called out. The constant vigilance required to care for shell-shock patients, combined with the responsibility for preventing escapes or suicide attempts, created enormous stress for medical personnel. Yet, this stress was rarely acknowledged or addressed, reflecting the assumption that caring for traumatized individuals was simply part of women's natural role. The family members of shell shock sufferers also experienced forms of secondary trauma that were largely unrecognized at the time. Wives and children living with shell shock veterans faced unpredictable behavior, emotional volatility, and often economic hardship. The impact on family relationships was profound and lasting. Many families found themselves isolated by the stigma associated with shell shock. Communities that might have rallied around a family whose father had lost a limb in the war were uncomfortable with a family whose father had lost his mind. The invisible nature of psychological wounds made them more difficult for others to understand and accept. The children of shell shock sufferers often grew up in households marked by fear and uncertainty. They learned to tiptoe around their fathers, never knowing when a loud noise or unexpected movement might trigger a violent reaction. The intergenerational transmission of trauma created lasting effects that extended far beyond the original sufferer. The geographical distribution of shell shock cases reveals important patterns about the relationship between combat conditions and psychological breakdown. Certain sectors of the Western Front, characterized by particularly intense fighting or harsh conditions, produced higher rates of shell shock. The Somme, Passchendaele, and Verdun became synonymous not only with military casualties, but also with psychological destruction. The temporal patterns of shell shock also provide insights into its causation. Rates of shell shock varied significantly over time, often correlating with major offensives and periods of intense fighting. However, the relationship was not straightforward. Some of the bloodiest battles produced relatively few shell shock cases, while periods of apparent quiet sometimes saw significant increases in psychological casualties. The seasonal variation in shell shock rates suggests that environmental factors played a role in the condition. The misery of winter in the trenches, with soldiers standing knee-deep in freezing mud for weeks at a time, created conditions that were particularly conducive to psychological breakdown. The promise of spring sometimes brought psychological as well as physical relief. The role of unit cohesion in preventing or exacerbating shell shock became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Units with strong bonds between officers and men, clear leadership, and high morale had lower rates of shell shock. Units where these elements were lacking experienced higher rates of breakdown. The importance of unit cohesion reflected the fundamentally social nature of shell shock. Men who felt supported by their comrades and confident in their leadership were better able to withstand stress than those who felt isolated or abandoned. The breakdown of social bonds under extreme stress often preceded individual psychological breakdown. The rotation of units between quiet and active sectors was recognized as an important factor in maintaining psychological health. Men who spent too long in active sectors without relief experienced higher rates of shell shock. The policy of rotating units provided periods of recovery that allowed psychological as well as physical recuperation. However, the demands of warfare often made proper rotation impossible. Chronic shortages of manpower meant that some units remained in active sectors for extended periods, leading to cumulative stress that eventually overwhelmed even the strongest men. The failure to provide adequate relief created conditions that made shell shock almost inevitable. The phenomenon of battle dreams or war dreams became a recognized feature of shell shock that persisted long after the war had ended. Veterans reported dreams so vivid and terrifying that they feared going to sleep. Some developed chronic insomnia to avoid the nightmares, leading to physical exhaustion that exacerbated their psychological symptoms. The content of shell shock dreams often involved reliving specific traumatic events with horrifying clarity. Veterans reported dreaming of being buried alive, watching comrades die, or being unable to escape from pursuing enemies. These dreams were distinguished from normal nightmares by their persistence, vividness, and resistance to conscious control. The study of shell shock dreams contributed to evolving understanding of memory and consciousness. Doctors observed that traumatic memories seemed to be encoded differently from normal memories, remaining vivid and emotionally charged, while normal memories faded. This observation would later contribute to theories about the neurobiology of trauma and the development of specific treatments for traumatic memories. The phenomenon of anniversary reactions also became apparent among shell shock sufferers. Many veterans experienced increased symptoms around the anniversaries of traumatic events or significant battles. These reactions often occurred without conscious awareness of the significance of the date, suggesting that traumatic memories were being processed at an unconscious level. The persistence of anniversary reactions for years or even decades after the war demonstrated the lasting nature of traumatic memory. Veterans who seemed to have recovered completely might suddenly experience severe symptoms when unconsciously reminded of their traumatic experiences. This pattern would later become recognized as a common feature of post-traumatic stress disorder. The development of veteran organizations and support groups represented an important response to the inadequacy of official medical care for shell shock. Veterans themselves often proved to be the most effective advocates for recognition and treatment of their condition. Their shared experiences created bonds that transcended traditional social boundaries and provided mutual support that was unavailable through official channels. The founding of organizations like Ex-Services Welfare Society in 1919 represented an early recognition that shell shock sufferers needed specialized support that was not being provided by existing institutions. These organizations were often staffed by veterans who understood shell shock from personal experience and could provide both practical assistance and emotional support. Combat Stress, established in 1919 by a group of women determined to end the stigma around psychological damage caused by warfare, became one of the most important sources of support for shell shock sufferers. The organization provided recuperative residential homes where veterans could live and work to rebuild their lives in humane conditions. The emphasis on dignity and respect represented a stark contrast to the punitive approaches often employed in military settings. The role of women in establishing support for shell shock sufferers reveals the gender dynamics of trauma care. While women were largely excluded from combat and thus from direct experience of shell shock, they often proved to be more empathetic and effective caregivers than their male counterparts. The absence of military hierarchy and masculine expectations allowed for more flexible and compassionate approaches to treatment. The post-war period saw continued evolution in understanding shell shock as more became known about its long-term effects. Follow-up studies of shell shock patients revealed that many continued to experience symptoms for years or even decades after the war. Some veterans who had seemed to recover completely during the war experienced delayed onset of symptoms years later. By 1929, more than a decade after the conclusion of the war, there were 74,167 shell shock cases still receiving care from the Ministry of Pensions. This number had actually increased from the immediate post-war period, suggesting that many veterans experienced delayed recognition of their condition or delayed seeking of treatment. The persistence of shell shock symptoms challenged medical assumptions about recovery and cure. Traditional medical models assumed that successful treatment would result in complete restoration of normal function. The reality of shell shock recovery was much more complex, with many patients experiencing ongoing symptoms that fluctuated in severity and required long-term management rather than cure. The economic burden of shell shock continued to grow throughout the interwar period. The ministry was paying for such rehabilitative pursuits as basket making and boot repairing for thousands of veterans who were unable to return to their pre-war occupations. The costs associated with shell shock care consumed an enormous portion of the government's medical budget. The financial pressures created by shell shock led to increasingly stringent criteria for pension eligibility and treatment access. Veterans found themselves fighting bureaucratic battles for recognition and support, often facing skeptical officials who questioned the legitimacy of their claims. The adversarial nature of the pension system added additional stress to men who were already struggling with psychological trauma. The cultural impact of shell shock extended far beyond individual cases to influence art, literature, and popular culture. The image of the shell-shocked veteran became a powerful symbol of the war's destructive effects and a challenge to romantic notions of military glory. Writers, artists, and filmmakers used shell shock as a metaphor for the broader psychological damage inflicted by the war. The paintings of Otto Dix and George Gross depicted shell-shocked veterans as broken figures haunting the streets of post-war Europe. These artistic representations helped to make visible the hidden wounds of war and to challenge society's attempts to ignore or minimize the psychological costs of conflict. The literary treatment of shell shock in works like Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy brought historical understanding of the condition to contemporary audiences and helped to rehabilitate the reputation of shell shock sufferers. These works emphasized the courage required to seek treatment and the dignity of those who struggled with psychological wounds. The influence of shell shock on popular memory of World War I cannot be overstated. The condition became emblematic of the war's senseless destruction and a symbol of the gap between official narratives of heroism and the reality of soldiers' experiences. Shell shock challenged comfortable assumptions about war and forced society to confront the true costs of conflict. The medical legacy of shell shock includes important advances in understanding trauma and developing psychological treatments. The recognition that extreme stress could cause psychological injury in normal individuals represented a fundamental shift in psychiatric thinking. This insight would prove crucial for the development of modern trauma psychology and the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. The development of talking therapies and psychological approaches to treatment during World War I laid the groundwork for modern psychotherapy. The observation that discussing traumatic experiences could be therapeutic challenged traditional medical models and opened new avenues for treating mental illness. The recognition of the importance of early intervention and forward treatment would influence military psychiatry for decades to come. The principles developed during World War I, treating casualties close to the front lines with the expectation of rapid recovery, would be refined and applied in subsequent conflicts with considerable success. However, the lessons of World War I shell shock were imperfectly learned and frequently forgotten. World War II saw a repetition of many of the same mistakes, with military authorities initially assuming that good training and leadership would prevent psychological casualties. The discovery that even well-trained and well-led troops could break down under sufficient stress forced a rediscovery of insights that had been gained during the previous war. The relationship between shell shock and later psychiatric diagnostic categories reveals the evolving nature of medical understanding. The term shell shock was gradually replaced by war neurosis, then combat fatigue, then combat stress reaction, and finally, post-traumatic stress disorder. Each new term reflected changing theories about the nature and causation of trauma-related symptoms. The evolution of diagnostic terminology also reflected changing social attitudes toward mental illness and trauma. The progression from shell shock, which implied physical causation, to post-traumatic stress disorder, which explicitly acknowledged psychological mechanisms, represents a fundamental shift in understanding human responses to extreme stress. The modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder owes much to the pioneering work done with shell shock patients during World War I. The recognition that trauma could cause lasting psychological changes, that symptoms might be delayed in onset, and that recovery required more than simple symptom suppression, all derived from observations made during the treatment of shell shock. The development of evidence-based treatments for PTSD has been informed by historical analysis of shell shock treatment approaches. The recognition that some historical treatments were effective while others were harmful has helped to guide the development of modern therapeutic approaches that emphasize safety, choice, and empowerment, rather than coercion and punishment. The study of shell shock has also contributed to understanding the social and cultural dimensions of trauma. The recognition that trauma symptoms are shaped not only by the traumatic experience itself, but also by social responses to that experience, has influenced approaches to trauma treatment that address stigma and social support, as well as individual symptoms. The question of prevention remains as relevant today as it was during World War I. Military organizations continue to struggle with the challenge of preparing soldiers for combat while acknowledging the psychological risks involved. The tension between military effectiveness and human welfare that characterized shell shock treatment during World War I persists in contemporary military medicine. Modern research on combat trauma has confirmed many of the observations made by World War I physicians while challenging others. The recognition that exposure to extreme stress can cause actual brain injury validates some of the original theories about shell shock's physical basis. However, the understanding of the mechanisms involved has become far more sophisticated. The blast-related brain injuries observed in veterans of recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan show remarkable similarities to historical descriptions of shell shock. Veterans exposed to improvised explosive devices exhibit symptoms of memory loss, emotional volatility, and cognitive impairment that closely resemble those described in World War I case histories. The persistence of these symptoms across different historical periods and different types of warfare suggests that there are fundamental human responses to extreme stress that transcend specific cultural and technological contexts. While the particular manifestations of trauma may vary, the underlying psychological mechanisms appear to be universal. The stigma associated with psychological injury remains a significant barrier to treatment and recovery, just as it was during World War I. Modern veterans often struggle with many of the same issues that confronted shell shock sufferers: concerns about being seen as weak, fears about career implications of seeking treatment, and difficulties in accessing appropriate care. The current statistic that upwards of 22 veterans commit suicide every day in the United States highlights the ongoing relevance of lessons learned from shell shock. This tragic reality suggests that society has not fully integrated the insights gained from studying shell shock, and that significant work remains in addressing the psychological wounds of war. The economic costs of combat trauma also remain significant. The Department of Veterans Affairs currently spends billions of dollars annually on treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and related conditions. These costs reflect both the scale of the problem and the long-term nature of trauma recovery. The development of specialized treatment programs for combat trauma represents progress from the ad hoc approaches used during World War I. However, the basic challenges remain the same: how to help traumatized individuals process their experiences, regain functioning, and reintegrate into society. The role of family and community support in trauma recovery has been recognized as crucial, building on observations made during the treatment of shell shock. The isolation experienced by many World War I veterans highlighted the importance of social connections in healing, leading to treatment approaches that emphasize community engagement and peer support. The question of compensation for psychological injury remains contentious, just as it was during World War I. The difficulty of objectively measuring psychological damage and the potential for malingering continue to complicate decisions about disability benefits and medical care. The moral injury component of combat trauma has also been recognized as significant, reflecting observations made about shell shock sufferers who struggled with guilt and shame about their actions or experiences during the war. The recognition that trauma involves not only fear and helplessness, but also moral and spiritual wounds, has influenced contemporary treatment approaches. The role of meaning-making in trauma recovery has been identified as crucial, building on insights gained from studying shell shock patients who struggled to find purpose and significance in their experiences. The existential dimensions of trauma require attention to questions of meaning, purpose, and spiritual well-being, as well as symptom management. The development of preventive approaches to combat trauma reflects lessons learned from shell shock about the importance of preparation, training, and support in building psychological resilience. However, the recognition that even the best preparation cannot completely prevent psychological injury has led to acceptance that trauma treatment will always be necessary in military contexts. The integration of trauma treatment into routine military medical care represents significant progress from the ad hoc responses to shell shock during World War I. The establishment of mental health professionals as regular members of military medical teams has helped to normalize psychological care and reduce stigma. However, the fundamental tension between military effectiveness and individual welfare that characterized shell shock treatment continues to influence military approaches to combat trauma. The need to maintain fighting capability while providing appropriate care for traumatized personnel remains a challenging balance. The historical study of shell shock has contributed to broader understanding of human responses to extreme stress and trauma. The recognition that psychological injury can be as severe and lasting as physical injury has influenced approaches to treating trauma in civilian contexts, as well as military ones. The development of trauma-informed care approaches across multiple sectors, including healthcare, education, and social services, reflects insights gained from studying shell shock about the pervasive effects of traumatic experiences and the importance of creating environments that support healing rather than re-traumatization. The shell shock experience also highlighted the importance of language and terminology in shaping understanding and treatment of mental health conditions. The evolution from shell shock to post-traumatic stress disorder reflects not only changing medical knowledge, but also changing social attitudes towards psychological distress. The power of diagnostic labels to either stigmatize or legitimize experiences of distress was clearly demonstrated in the shell shock era. The terms used to describe psychological symptoms influenced how those symptoms were understood by both sufferers and society, affecting everything from treatment options to social acceptance. The research into shell shock also revealed the complex relationship between individual vulnerability and environmental stress in the development of psychological symptoms. While some individuals appeared more susceptible to shell shock than others, the extreme conditions of the Western Front demonstrated that anyone could break down under sufficient pressure. This recognition of universal vulnerability challenged assumptions about character and resilience that had previously dominated thinking about psychological breakdown. The idea that shell shock represented a normal response to abnormal circumstances rather than evidence of abnormal character represented a fundamental shift in understanding human psychology. The role of social support in both the development and recovery from shell shock became increasingly apparent through clinical observation. Soldiers with strong connections to their units and confidence in their leaders were less likely to develop shell shock and more likely to recover if they did break down. Conversely, soldiers who felt isolated, unsupported, or abandoned by their leaders were more vulnerable to psychological breakdown and had poorer outcomes in treatment. These observations highlighted the fundamentally social nature of both trauma and recovery. The development of peer support approaches to shell shock treatment represented an early recognition of the value of shared experience in healing. Veterans who had recovered from shell shock often proved to be effective counselors for men who were still struggling with the condition. Their credibility and understanding of the experience provided something that medical professionals, however well-intentioned, could not offer. The concept of moral injury, while not explicitly recognized during the shell shock era, was implicitly present in many case histories. Veterans struggled not only with fear and anxiety, but also with guilt, shame, and questions about the meaning of their experiences. The moral dimensions of trauma proved to be as important as the psychological ones. The treatment of shell shock also revealed the importance of hope and expectation in recovery. Patients who believed they could recover were more likely to do so than those who saw their condition as permanent. This observation influenced treatment approaches that emphasized the temporary nature of symptoms and the possibility of full recovery. However, the emphasis on expectation of recovery sometimes created additional pressure for patients who were struggling with persistent symptoms. The suggestion that failure to recover reflected inadequate effort or insufficient motivation could add shame and self-blame to the burden of trauma symptoms. The role of time in shell shock recovery was poorly understood during World War I, but became increasingly apparent in follow-up studies. Many veterans experienced fluctuating symptoms over years or decades, with periods of apparent recovery followed by relapses triggered by stress or reminders of their traumatic experiences. The recognition that trauma recovery is often a long-term process rather than a brief episode influenced later approaches to treatment that emphasized ongoing support and management rather than quick cures. The unrealistic expectations for rapid recovery that characterized much of World War I shell shock treatment were gradually replaced by more patient-centered approaches. The pharmacological dimension of shell shock treatment was limited by the available medications of the time. Doctors prescribed bromide salts, mixtures of strychnine and belladonna, as well as analgesics like acetyl salicylic acid and phenacetin. These medications provided limited relief and often had significant side effects that complicated treatment. The lack of effective medications meant that shell shock treatment relied primarily on psychological and environmental interventions. This limitation may have actually been beneficial, as it forced doctors to develop non-pharmacological approaches that address the underlying causes of symptoms, rather than simply suppressing them. The nutrition and physical care of shell shock patients was recognized as important for recovery. Many patients had poor appetites and had lost significant weight during their traumatic experiences. The provision of adequate nutrition and physical comfort was seen as a necessary foundation for psychological healing. The use of massage, baths, and other physical comfort measures reflected an understanding that psychological trauma affected the entire person, not just the mind. The integration of physical and psychological care represented an early form of holistic treatment that recognized the interconnection between body and mind. The institutional responses to shell shock revealed important insights about the relationship between organizational culture and individual well-being. Hospitals and treatment centers that created environments of respect, dignity, and hope achieved better outcomes than those that emphasized discipline and punishment. The administrative challenges of caring for large numbers of shell shock patients also highlighted the importance of systematic approaches to trauma care. The improvised responses that characterized early shell shock treatment gradually gave way to more organized and consistent approaches based on accumulated experience. The training of medical personnel to treat shell shock represented an important development in medical education. The recognition that shell shock required specialized knowledge and skills led to the establishment of training programs that taught doctors about psychological approaches to treatment. However, the training available during World War I was often brief and superficial. Many doctors were expected to treat shell shock cases with minimal preparation, leading to inconsistent care and sometimes harmful interventions. The need for more comprehensive training in trauma treatment became apparent, but was not fully addressed until later conflicts. The documentation and record-keeping related to shell shock cases was often poor, reflecting the low priority assigned to psychological casualties and the stigma associated with the condition. Many records were incomplete, destroyed, or never created in the first place. This lack of documentation has made historical study of shell shock difficult and has obscured many individual stories of suffering and recovery. The records that do survive provide valuable insights into the human experience of shell shock and the various approaches to treatment that were employed. These documents reveal both the compassion and the cruelty that characterized responses to psychological trauma during this period. The legal dimensions of shell shock created additional complications for sufferers and their families. The distinction between medical disability and disciplinary action was often unclear, leaving veterans uncertain about their rights and entitlements. Some men were simultaneously treated as patients and prosecuted as malingerers. The courts-martial of shell shock sufferers often failed to consider the medical evidence about their condition. Military law was designed to maintain discipline rather than to achieve justice in individual cases, leading to harsh punishments for men who were suffering from genuine medical conditions. The posthumous pardons granted to executed soldiers in 2006 represented a belated recognition of the injustices committed during the shell shock era. While these pardons could not undo the suffering caused, they provided some measure of acknowledgement that society's understanding of psychological trauma had evolved significantly. The international efforts to understand and treat shell shock during World War I represented early examples of medical cooperation across national boundaries. Doctors from different countries shared information about treatment approaches and collaborated on research despite the political divisions created by the war. This international cooperation contributed to the development of more effective treatments and helped to establish shell shock as a legitimate medical condition rather than simply a national embarrassment. The shared experience of dealing with psychological casualties created common ground between former enemies and contributed to post-war reconciliation efforts. The influence of shell shock on military doctrine and training was profound and lasting. The recognition that psychological casualties could be as significant as physical ones led to changes in military planning, tactics, and personnel policies. The need to maintain psychological as well as physical health became an accepted part of military medicine. The development of psychological screening for military recruits, while often flawed in its implementation, represented an early attempt to prevent psychological casualties through selection. The idea that some individuals might be more vulnerable to psychological breakdown led to efforts to identify and exclude such individuals from military service. However, the screening approaches used during and after World War I were often based on social prejudices rather than scientific understanding. Many of the criteria used to exclude potential recruits reflected class, ethnic, and cultural biases rather than genuine predictors of psychological vulnerability. The evolution of military training to include psychological preparation represented another important development influenced by shell shock experience. The recognition that soldiers needed mental as well as physical preparation for combat led to training programs that attempted to build psychological resilience. However, the effectiveness of such training was limited by incomplete understanding of trauma mechanisms and the unique stresses of individual combat experiences. The reality that even the best prepared soldiers could break down under sufficient stress remained a challenge to military planning and doctrine. The shell shock experience also influenced civilian approaches to mental health and trauma treatment. The recognition that normal individuals could develop severe psychological symptoms under extreme stress challenged traditional assumptions about mental illness as evidence of inherent deficiency. The development of psychological theories and treatments during the shell shock era contributed to the broader acceptance of psychology and psychiatry as legitimate medical specialties. The demonstration that psychological interventions could be effective in treating severe symptoms helped to establish mental health as a medical, rather than simply a moral issue. The shell shock era also highlighted the importance of social attitudes in shaping both the development and treatment of psychological symptoms. The stigma associated with mental illness was shown to be not only cruel, but also counterproductive, preventing early intervention and effective treatment. The efforts to reduce stigma around shell shock, while only partially successful during the World War I period, established principles that would guide later mental health advocacy. The recognition that changing social attitudes was as important as improving medical treatment became a cornerstone of mental health reform movements. The research into shell shock also contributed to understanding the relationship between trauma and creativity. The observation that many shell shock sufferers found relief through writing, art, and other creative activities suggested that creativity could serve both as a symptom of recovery and a means of achieving it. The therapeutic use of creative expression during shell shock treatment influenced the development of art therapy, music therapy, and other expressive therapies. The recognition that creativity could provide a pathway to healing opened new possibilities for trauma treatment that went beyond traditional medical models. The shell shock experience demonstrated the importance of meaning-making in trauma recovery. Veterans who were able to find some purpose or significance in their suffering were more likely to achieve meaningful recovery than those who saw their experiences as purely destructive. The search for meaning often involved reframing traumatic experiences in terms of service, sacrifice, or learning. Veterans who could see their suffering as having contributed to something larger than themselves were better able to integrate their experiences and move forward with their lives. The role of spirituality and faith in shell shock recovery was complex and varied. Some veterans found comfort in religious faith, seeing their survival as evidence of divine protection or their suffering as part of a larger divine plan. Others lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their experiences with beliefs about a benevolent God. The spiritual crisis experienced by many veterans was often as profound as their psychological trauma. The challenge of maintaining faith and hope in the face of senseless suffering required resources that were rarely addressed in medical treatment. The neglect of spiritual dimensions of trauma recovery represented a significant gap in care that would not be fully addressed until much later. The shell shock era also revealed the importance of narrative and storytelling in trauma recovery. Veterans who were able to construct coherent narratives about their experiences were more likely to achieve meaningful recovery than those whose memories remained fragmented and chaotic. The development of life story approaches to trauma treatment built on observations made during shell shock treatment about the importance of helping patients create coherent accounts of their experiences. The ability to tell one story in a way that made sense was recognized as both a sign of recovery and a means of achieving it. The collective dimensions of shell shock also deserve attention. The condition affected not only individuals but entire units, communities, and societies. The shared nature of traumatic experiences created bonds between veterans that transcended traditional social boundaries and provided sources of mutual support. The development of veteran communities and support networks represented an important response to the inadequacy of official care systems. Veterans often found that other veterans were the only people who truly understood their experiences and could provide meaningful support. The political dimensions of shell shock became increasingly apparent in the post-war period. Veterans' organizations became advocates for recognition, treatment, and compensation, challenging official narratives that minimize the psychological costs of war. The political mobilization of shell shock sufferers contributed to broader social movements for mental health reform. The influence of shell shock on anti-war movements was also significant. The visible evidence of war's psychological costs provided powerful arguments against romantic notions of military glory and helped to fuel pacifist movements during the interwar period. The shell shock experience contributed to changing understanding of masculinity and courage. The recognition that strong, brave men could be broken by extreme stress challenged traditional notions of masculine invulnerability and helped to create space for more nuanced understanding of human responses to adversity. The redefinition of courage to include seeking help for psychological wounds represented an important cultural shift that began during the shell shock era. The idea that it took courage to acknowledge psychological distress and seek treatment challenged traditional masculine norms that equated seeking help with weakness. The technological dimensions of shell shock reflected the broader impact of industrialization on human experience. The mechanized warfare of World War I created stresses that were qualitatively different from those experienced in previous conflicts, requiring new approaches to understanding and treatment. The recognition that technological change could create new forms of human suffering influenced broader discussions about the relationship between progress and human welfare. The shell shock experience contributed to growing awareness that technological advancement did not necessarily represent human progress. The environmental factors in shell shock development and recovery highlighted the importance of physical surroundings in psychological well-being. The contrast between the horror of the trenches and the peace of hospital gardens demonstrated the therapeutic value of natural environments. The use of occupational therapy and outdoor activities in shell shock treatment built on observations about the healing power of engagement with the natural world. The recognition that environment could be either therapeutic or traumatizing influenced later approaches to trauma treatment that emphasized the importance of creating safe, healing spaces. The shell shock era also revealed important insights about the relationship between individual and collective trauma. The shared nature of traumatic experiences created both mutual support and collective symptoms. Entire units could experience psychological breakdowns simultaneously, suggesting that trauma had social as well as individual dimensions. The concept of collective trauma, while not explicitly recognized during World War I, was implicit in observations about unit morale, esprit de corps, and the contagious nature of psychological symptoms. The recognition that trauma could affect groups as well as individuals would later influence approaches to treating large-scale disasters and collective traumatic experiences. The medical ethics of shell shock treatment raised important questions that continue to be relevant today. The dual loyalty of military physicians to both patient welfare and military effectiveness created ethical dilemmas that were rarely acknowledged or addressed during World War I. The use of coercive treatments, the pressure to return patients to combat, and the denial of care to some sufferers all represented ethical failures that were recognized only in retrospect. The shell shock experience contributed to the development of medical ethics frameworks that emphasize patient autonomy and informed consent. The research ethics of shell shock treatment were also problematic by modern standards. Patients were often subjected to experimental treatments without adequate informed consent or follow-up care. The pressure to develop effective treatments led to approaches that prioritized rapid results over patient safety and well-being. The recognition of these ethical failures has influenced contemporary research ethics frameworks that emphasize the protection of vulnerable populations and the importance of balancing research benefits with potential harms. The shell shock experience serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining ethical standards even in crisis situations. The educational dimensions of shell shock treatment highlighted the importance of patient education in recovery. Approaches like reverse autognosis, which emphasized helping patients understand their condition, proved more effective than treatments that kept patients ignorant about their symptoms and prognosis. The recognition that educated patients were more likely to participate actively in their recovery influenced later treatment approaches that emphasized patient empowerment and shared decision-making. The shell shock experience demonstrated that treating patients as partners rather than passive recipients of care improved outcomes. The shell shock era also contributed to understanding the relationship between physical and psychological health. The observation that psychological symptoms could manifest as apparent physical disabilities challenged traditional mind-body dualism and contributed to more integrated approaches to healthcare. The recognition that psychological stress could cause real physical symptoms validated the experiences of shell shock sufferers and helped to establish the legitimacy of psychological medicine. The integration of physical and psychological care became an important principle in trauma treatment. The occupational dimensions of shell shock recovery highlighted the importance of meaningful work in psychological healing. Veterans who were able to return to productive employment generally had better outcomes than those who remained idle or engaged only in make-work activities. The recognition that work could be therapeutic as well as economically necessary influenced the development of vocational rehabilitation programs for trauma survivors. The emphasis on helping veterans develop new skills and find meaningful employment became an important component of comprehensive trauma care. The shell shock experience also revealed the importance of peer relationships in both trauma development and recovery. Soldiers who maintained strong bonds with their comrades were more resilient in the face of stress and recovered more quickly if they did break down. The recognition of the therapeutic value of peer support led to the development of veteran support groups and peer counseling programs. The unique understanding that comes from shared experience was acknowledged as a valuable resource that complemented professional treatment. The role of leadership in preventing and addressing shell shock became increasingly recognized as the war progressed. Officers who took a personal interest in their men's welfare and created environments of trust and support had units with lower rates of psychological casualties. The leadership lessons learned from the shell shock experience influenced military training programs and leadership development initiatives. The recognition that caring for soldiers' psychological well-being was as important as maintaining their physical health became an accepted part of military leadership responsibility. The shell shock era also highlighted the importance of organizational culture in shaping responses to stress and trauma. Military units with cultures that supported help-seeking and acknowledged the reality of psychological injury had better outcomes than those that stigmatized mental health problems. The influence of organizational culture on trauma outcomes became an important focus for intervention, with efforts to create environments that supported resilience and recovery rather than simply demanding performance and compliance. As we consider the legacy of shell shock more than a century after the end of World War I, several key insights emerge that continue to influence our understanding of trauma and its treatment. First, the recognition that extreme stress can cause psychological injury in normal, healthy individuals challenged fundamental assumptions about mental illness and established the legitimacy of trauma-related disorders. Second, the observation that trauma symptoms can be delayed in onset and persistent in duration demonstrated the need for long-term approaches to care and support. The idea that trauma recovery is a process rather than an event influenced treatment approaches that emphasize ongoing support rather than quick fixes. Third, the recognition that social attitudes and support systems play crucial roles in both trauma development and recovery highlighted the importance of addressing stigma and building community resources for trauma survivors. The shell shock experience demonstrated that individual healing cannot be separated from social healing. Fourth, the development of psychological approaches to trauma treatment established principles and techniques that continue to influence contemporary practice. The talking cure, pioneered by Rivers and others, laid the groundwork for modern psychotherapy and demonstrated the value of helping patients process and integrate their traumatic experiences. Fifth, the shell shock experience revealed the importance of meaning-making in trauma recovery. Veterans who were able to find purpose and significance in their suffering were more likely to achieve meaningful recovery than those who saw their experiences as purely destructive. This insight influenced later treatments that emphasize post-traumatic growth and meaning-making. Finally, the shell shock era demonstrated the complex relationship between individual vulnerability and environmental stress in trauma development. While some individuals may be more susceptible to trauma than others, the extreme conditions of modern warfare showed that anyone can be overwhelmed by sufficient stress. This recognition influenced approaches to trauma prevention that emphasize environmental modification as well as individual preparation. The story of shell shock is ultimately a story about human resilience and vulnerability in the face of unprecedented stress. The men who suffered from shell shock were not weak or cowardly. They were normal human beings, overwhelmed by abnormal circumstances. Their struggles and their gradual recovery helped to establish our modern understanding of trauma and its treatment. The medical professionals who treated shell shock were pioneers working without roadmaps in uncharted territory. Some, like Lewis Yealland, pursued approaches that seemed barbaric by modern standards, but were considered scientific and progressive at the time. Others, like William Rivers, developed compassionate methods that anticipated modern trauma treatment by decades. The diversity of approaches to shell shock treatment reflected the genuine uncertainty about the condition's nature and the desperate search for effective interventions. The medical profession was confronted with a phenomenon that challenged existing knowledge and required the development of entirely new approaches to understanding and treating mental distress. The institutional memory of shell shock was poorly preserved, leading to repetition of many mistakes in subsequent conflicts. The destruction of medical records during World War II eliminated much of the documentary evidence about shell shock treatment, making it difficult for later physicians to build on the lessons learned during the Great War. The cultural memory of shell shock has been better preserved through literature, art, and popular culture. Works like Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy have kept the shell shock experience alive in public consciousness and have contributed to understanding the historical development of trauma treatment. The ongoing relevance of shell shock is demonstrated by continued research into its mechanisms and manifestations. Modern neuroscience has provided new insights into the brain changes associated with traumatic stress, validating many of the observations made by World War I physicians while challenging others. The blast-related brain injuries observed in recent conflicts have rekindled interest in the original theories about shell shock's physical basis. The recognition that explosive forces can cause actual brain damage has led to renewed appreciation for the complexity of combat trauma and the multiple mechanisms that may be involved. The development of brain imaging technology has allowed researchers to observe the neurological effects of trauma in ways that were impossible during the shell shock era. These studies have revealed specific patterns of brain activation and structure that are associated with trauma symptoms, providing objective evidence for conditions that were once dismissed as purely psychological. The genetic research into trauma vulnerability has also provided new insights into individual differences in susceptibility to psychological injury. While the extreme conditions of World War I demonstrated that anyone could develop shell shock under sufficient stress, research has revealed that genetic factors may influence individual resilience and recovery. The epigenetic research into trauma transmission has revealed that traumatic experiences can actually alter gene expression in ways that may be passed to future generations. This research could provide a biological basis for the intergenerational effects of trauma that were observed in shell shock families but were not understood at the time. The development of evidence-based treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder has validated some historical approaches while discrediting others. Cognitive behavioral therapies that help patients process and reframe traumatic experiences build on principles established during the shell shock era, while coercive treatments, like those used by Yealland, have been abandoned as both ineffective and unethical, though this assessment reflects our current understanding rather than the medical standards of the time. The recognition of the importance of patient choice and empowerment in trauma treatment represents a significant advance from the paternalistic approaches that characterized much of shell shock care. Modern trauma treatment emphasizes collaboration between patient and therapist, rather than the authoritarian approaches that were common during World War I. The development of specialized trauma treatment programs has created more systematic and effective approaches to care than were available during the shell shock era. However, access to these programs remains limited, and many trauma survivors continue to struggle with inadequate care and support. The ongoing stigma associated with psychological injury, while reduced from shell shock era levels, continues to prevent many trauma survivors from seeking appropriate treatment. The cultural work of changing attitudes toward mental health remains incomplete, requiring continued education and advocacy. The shell shock experience provides important historical perspective on contemporary debates about trauma and its treatment. The recognition that understanding of trauma has evolved significantly over time should promote humility about current knowledge and openness to continued learning and development. The political dimensions of trauma recognition and treatment remain as relevant today as they were during the shell shock era. The decision to acknowledge trauma as a legitimate injury requiring care and compensation continues to involve political as well as medical considerations. The resource allocation decisions that determine access to trauma treatment continue to reflect the same tensions between individual need and institutional capacity that characterized shell shock care. The challenge of providing adequate care for all trauma survivors while managing costs and maintaining other priorities remains unresolved. The shell shock era demonstrated that trauma affects not only individuals, but also families, communities, and entire societies. The ripple effects of psychological injury extend far beyond the immediate sufferer, creating needs for support and intervention that go beyond individual treatment. The recognition of these broader effects has influenced contemporary approaches to trauma care that emphasize family involvement, community support, and social intervention, as well as individual treatment. The shell shock experience showed that trauma recovery requires more than just medical care. It requires social healing as well. The prevention of trauma remains a significant challenge, just as it was during the shell shock era. While understanding of risk factors and protective factors has improved, the basic challenge of preparing individuals for extreme stress, while acknowledging that such stress can overwhelm anyone, remains unresolved. The shell shock experience also highlighted the importance of early intervention in trauma treatment. The observation that prompt treatment was more effective than delayed treatment established principles that continue to guide contemporary trauma care. However, the challenge of identifying and treating trauma symptoms early remains significant. The development of trauma-informed approaches to education, healthcare, and social services reflects lessons learned from shell shock about the pervasive effects of traumatic experiences. The recognition that trauma can affect all aspects of functioning has led to more comprehensive approaches to care and support. The shell shock experience demonstrated the importance of hope and recovery orientation in trauma treatment. Approaches that emphasized the possibility of recovery and normal functioning were more effective than those that focused only on managing symptoms or accepting limitations. The development of recovery-oriented approaches to mental health care builds on insights gained from shell shock treatment about the importance of maintaining hope and working toward meaningful goals rather than simply controlling symptoms. The shell shock era also revealed the complex relationship between trauma and resilience. While some individuals appeared more vulnerable to psychological breakdown, others demonstrated remarkable capacity to endure extreme stress without developing significant symptoms. The study of resilience factors has become an important area of trauma research, building on observations made during the shell shock era about individual and group characteristics that promote psychological survival. However, the emphasis on resilience must be balanced with recognition that even the most resilient individuals can be overwhelmed by sufficient stress. The shell shock experience provided important insights about the relationship between trauma and social change. The widespread nature of psychological casualties during World War I contributed to broader changes in social attitudes toward mental health, military service, and individual rights. The recognition that trauma could catalyze social and personal transformation, as well as destruction, influenced later approaches to trauma treatment that emphasize post-traumatic growth and positive adaptation. The idea that trauma survivors could emerge stronger and wiser from their experiences provided hope for recovery that went beyond simple restoration of previous functioning. The technological dimensions of shell shock treatment continue to evolve with advances in medical technology. Modern brain imaging, genetic testing, and pharmacological interventions provide treatment options that were unimaginable during the shell shock era. However, the basic human elements of trauma care, compassion, understanding, patience, and hope, remain as important today as they were during World War I. The technological advances must be combined with the human wisdom gained from studying shell shock to provide truly effective trauma care. The shell shock experience also highlighted the importance of research and documentation in advancing understanding of trauma. The limited records that survive from the shell shock era provide valuable insights, but the gaps in documentation have hampered efforts to fully understand the condition and its treatment. The emphasis on systematic data collection and rigorous research in contemporary trauma studies builds on lessons learned from the shell shock era about the importance of preserving knowledge and learning from experience. The commitment to evidence-based practice reflects recognition that good intentions are not sufficient. Effective treatments must be based on solid research and careful evaluation. The global dimensions of trauma have become increasingly apparent since the shell shock era. The recognition that trauma is a universal human response to extreme stress has led to international cooperation in research and treatment development. The lessons learned from shell shock have been applied in contexts far removed from military combat. The humanitarian applications of trauma knowledge gained from shell shock have helped to improve responses to natural disasters, mass violence, and other large-scale traumatic events. The principles of early intervention, social support, and meaning-making that were developed during shell shock treatment have proven relevant across diverse cultural and situational contexts. The shell shock experience also contributed to understanding the relationship between individual trauma and historical change. The psychological casualties of World War I were both symptoms of broader social upheaval and catalysts for further change. The recognition of this dynamic relationship has influenced approaches to understanding and responding to collective trauma. The memorial and commemorative dimensions of shell shock reflect ongoing efforts to honor and remember those who suffered psychological wounds in service to their countries. The inclusion of shell shock sufferers in war memorials and remembrance ceremonies represents recognition that their sacrifices were as real and significant as those who died in battle. The evolution of military culture to acknowledge and honor psychological sacrifice represents significant progress from the shell shock era, when such sacrifice was often denied or stigmatized. However, the challenge of balancing military effectiveness with human welfare continues to create tensions that echo those of the World War I period. The shell shock era established principles and precedents that continue to influence contemporary trauma care, but also demonstrated the provisional nature of medical knowledge and the importance of remaining open to new understanding. The physicians who treated shell shock were doing their best with limited knowledge and resources, just as contemporary practitioners work within the constraints of current understanding. The humility that comes from recognizing the limitations of historical knowledge should inform current approaches to trauma treatment. The recognition that future generations may view contemporary treatments as primitive or misguided should promote careful evaluation of current practices and openness to alternative approaches. The shell shock era also demonstrated the importance of learning from patients as well as from medical research. Some of the most important insights about trauma came from listening to sufferers describe their experiences rather than from laboratory studies or theoretical speculation. The emphasis on patient voice and experience in contemporary trauma treatment builds on this recognition that those who have lived through trauma possess unique knowledge that must be incorporated into understanding and treatment. The partnership between patients and professionals that characterizes modern trauma care represents an advance from the more paternalistic approaches of the shell shock era. The shell shock experience revealed the crucial importance of social attitudes in shaping both trauma development and recovery. The stigma associated with psychological injury not only caused additional suffering, but also prevented effective treatment and contributed to poor outcomes. The ongoing efforts to reduce stigma around mental health issues build on lessons learned from the shell shock era about the therapeutic value of acceptance and understanding. The recognition that social healing is as important as individual healing continues to influence approaches to trauma care and advocacy. The shell shock era also highlighted the economic dimensions of trauma care and the importance of adequate resources for treatment and support. The financial pressures that influence shell shock policy decisions continue to affect contemporary trauma care, creating ongoing challenges in providing adequate resources for all who need them. The tension between the immediate costs of comprehensive trauma care and the long-term costs of inadequate treatment remains relevant today. The shell shock experience demonstrated that failing to provide adequate initial care often led to higher long-term costs as problems became chronic and more difficult to treat. The shell shock era established important precedents for the recognition of service-connected disabilities and the responsibility of society to care for those injured in military service. The principle that psychological injuries deserve the same recognition and support as physical injuries continues to guide contemporary veterans' care policies. However, the implementation of these principles remains challenging, with ongoing debates about causation, diagnosis, and appropriate levels of support. The shell shock experience provides historical context for understanding these contemporary debates and the progress that has been made in recognizing and treating combat trauma. The shell shock era also contributed to broader understanding of the relationship between war and society. The recognition that war's costs extend far beyond immediate battlefield casualties influenced later thinking about the true price of conflict and the responsibilities of nations that engage in warfare. The hidden costs of war, including the long-term care of psychologically wounded veterans, became more visible through the shell shock experience. This recognition has influenced contemporary debates about the costs and benefits of military interventions and the responsibility to care for those who serve. As we reflect on the century that has passed since the end of World War I, the legacy of shell shock continues to influence our understanding of trauma and its treatment. The brave men who suffered from this condition and the dedicated physicians who struggled to help them contributed to knowledge that has benefited countless trauma survivors in the years since. The evolution from shell shock to post-traumatic stress disorder represents both progress in understanding and continuity in human experience. While our knowledge of trauma has advanced dramatically, the basic human responses to extreme stress remain fundamentally unchanged. The shell shock sufferers of World War I were not so different from the veterans of contemporary conflicts who struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder. Their experiences of fear, helplessness, and psychological injury are universal human responses to inhuman circumstances. The treatments that proved most effective during the shell shock era, compassionate care, patient education, social support, meaningful activity, and hope for recovery, remain the foundations of contemporary trauma treatment. While the specific techniques have evolved, the basic principles of effective trauma care were established during this period. The shell shock era also demonstrated the importance of social recognition and support in trauma recovery. The veterans who received acknowledgement for their service and validation for their suffering generally had better outcomes than those who faced denial and stigma. The ongoing work of honoring and remembering shell shock sufferers represents not only historical justice, but also therapeutic necessity. The recognition of their sacrifice and suffering provides meaning that can facilitate healing and contribute to prevention of future trauma. The study of shell shock has also contributed to understanding the relationship between individual and collective memory of traumatic events. The way societies remember and commemorate trauma influences both individual recovery and collective resilience. The shell shock experience provides a powerful reminder that the costs of war extend far beyond the battlefield and persist long after the fighting has ended. The psychological wounds inflicted by the Great War continue to affect individuals, families, and communities for decades after the armistice. The recognition of these enduring costs should inform contemporary decisions about military intervention and conflict engagement. The full price of war includes not only immediate casualties, but also the long-term care of those whose minds as well as bodies have been wounded in service to their countries. The shell shock era established important precedents for the humane treatment of trauma survivors and the recognition of psychological injury as legitimate and deserving of care. While progress has been made in implementing these principles, the work of creating truly effective and accessible trauma care continues. The legacy of shell shock reminds us that trauma is not a sign of weakness, but rather evidence of humanity in the face of inhumane circumstances. The courage required to acknowledge psychological wounds and seek treatment is as real as any battlefield bravery and deserves equal recognition and honor. The men who suffered from shell shock during the Great War were casualties of a conflict that exceeded all previous bounds of human destructiveness. Their psychological wounds were as real and as lasting as any physical injuries, and their struggles to recover contributed to knowledge that continues to help trauma survivors today. Their stories remind us that behind every statistic about war, casualties are individual human beings who suffered, struggled, and often overcame tremendous adversity. The shell-shock sufferers of World War I deserve to be remembered not as examples of weakness or failure, but as pioneers in understanding the human costs of modern warfare and the possibility of healing from even the most severe psychological wounds. The hidden wounds of the Great War may have been invisible, but they were no less real than the visible scars carried by other veterans. The men who suffered from shell shock paid a price for their service that was not fully recognized or honored at the time, but their sacrifice contributed to understanding that has benefited countless others. As we remember the Great War and its aftermath, we must include in our remembrance those whose wounds were hidden but whose suffering was profound. The shell-shock sufferers of World War I were among the first to experience and survive the psychological trauma of industrial warfare, and their experiences provide both historical insight and contemporary guidance for understanding and treating the invisible wounds of war. The journey from shell shock to post-traumatic stress disorder represents more than just a change in terminology. It reflects a fundamental shift in how society understands and responds to psychological injury. The recognition that trauma is a normal response to abnormal circumstances, that recovery is possible with appropriate care, and that trauma survivors deserve compassion rather than judgment, all derive from lessons learned during the shell shock era. The work of caring for trauma survivors continues today, building on the foundation established by those who first recognized and treated shell shock during the Great War. Their pioneering efforts, both successes and failures, continue to inform our understanding and guide our responses to the psychological wounds inflicted by war and other traumatic experiences. The shell-shock sufferers of World War I were unwilling pioneers in understanding the human costs of modern warfare. Their courage in seeking treatment, their persistence in advocating for recognition, and their gradual recovery from devastating psychological wounds established precedents that continue to benefit trauma survivors today. Their legacy reminds us that the true measure of a civilization is not only how it prepares for war, but how it cares for those who are wounded in its service. The hidden wounds of the Great War teach us that psychological injuries are as real and deserving of care as any physical wounds, and that the work of healing extends far beyond the battlefield to encompass families, communities, and entire societies. The story of shell shock is ultimately a story of human resilience, the capacity to survive, adapt, and eventually heal from even the most devastating psychological wounds. While the specific circumstances of the Great War were unique, the human responses to trauma that it revealed are universal and timeless. Understanding shell shock helps us to better understand ourselves and our responses to stress and adversity. The men who suffered from this condition were not fundamentally different from any of us. They were ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances who did their best to survive and recover. Their experiences remind us that trauma is not a personal failing, but rather a human response to inhuman circumstances. The compassion and understanding that they deserved, but often did not receive, must guide our responses to contemporary trauma survivors. The hidden wounds of the Great War continue to teach us about the true costs of conflict and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The shell-shock sufferers of World War I paid a terrible price for our understanding of trauma, but their sacrifice was not in vain. Their experiences continue to guide and inspire efforts to heal the psychological wounds of war and to build a more compassionate and understanding society. In remembering the shell-shock sufferers of the Great War, we honor not only their service and sacrifice, but also their contribution to human knowledge and healing. Their hidden wounds became visible through their courage in seeking treatment and their persistence in advocating for recognition. Their legacy continues to benefit trauma survivors around the world, making their suffering meaningful and their recovery inspiring. The Great War was called the war to end all wars, but it was not. However, the understanding of trauma that emerged from treating shell shock has helped to reduce the psychological casualties of subsequent conflicts and to provide better care for those who are wounded. In this sense, the suffering of shell shock patients has contributed to progress in reducing the hidden wounds of war. As we conclude this examination of shell shock and its legacy, we are reminded that the work of understanding and treating trauma is ongoing. Each generation builds on the knowledge gained by previous generations while facing new challenges and developing new insights. The shell shock sufferers of World War I were the first to experience trauma on the scale created by industrial warfare, but they will not be the last to face psychological injury in service to their countries. Their experiences provide both historical understanding and contemporary guidance for the ongoing work of caring for those whose minds as well as bodies have been wounded by war. Their courage in facing their demons, seeking treatment, and working toward recovery provides inspiration for all who struggle with psychological wounds. Their legacy reminds us that healing is possible, that trauma survivors deserve compassion and support, and that society has a responsibility to care for those who have sacrificed their peace of mind in service to others. The hidden wounds of the Great War teach us that the true casualties of conflict include not only those who die, but also those who survive with minds forever changed by their experiences. The shell shock sufferers of World War I were among the first to bear these hidden wounds, and their experiences continue to illuminate the path toward understanding, compassion, and healing. In closing, the story of shell shock serves as both historical record and contemporary guide. It reminds us of how far we have come in understanding trauma while highlighting how much work remains to be done. The men who suffered from shell shock during the Great War were pioneers in a journey toward healing that continues today, and their legacy inspires continued efforts to understand and treat the psychological wounds of war. If you found this exploration of shell shock and its lasting impact meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from history that continue to shape our understanding of the human experience of war and trauma. The hidden wounds of the Great War have much to teach us about resilience, recovery, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity.